It's late October, and, the election ads are just playing on an endless loop.
Oh, yeah. Completely inescapable.
Right. I mean, they're on your television, they're on your phone, they're on the billboards you pass on your commute.
You can't hide from them.
You really can't. The rhetoric is just turned up to a deafening volume. And, sitting there in traffic, you might find yourself daydreaming about this ultimate political fantasy. Like, what if we just banned political parties entirely?
I mean, honestly, it sounds incredibly peaceful.
Doesn't it? Just this utopian vision for anyone who is exhausted by the sheer friction of partisanship.
Yeah, you wouldn't have party whips. There's no voting along rigid party lines, no grandstanding for the political base.
Yeah.
Just individual representatives voting their conscience, looking at the raw facts of an issue.
Right, exactly. It sounds perfect on paper. But here's where it gets really interesting, because when you look at history, that utopian daydream has actually been tried.
And not by idealists either?
No, not at all. It was tried by absolute iron-fisted military dictators. We are talking about authoritarian leaders in places like Spain under Franco, or, the military juntas in Chile and Brazil.
Right, guys with absolute control.
Yeah, they actively banned political parties because they viewed them as corrupt engines of division. But here's the crazy part. Even those guys with total military supremacy, leaders who could literally dictate the law at gunpoint, they eventually had to go out and create their own obedient political parties.
Which presents a really profound paradox, if you think about it.
How so?
Well, you have these regimes with absolute military control, right? They have the entirety of the state apparatus at their disposal, and yet they inevitably discover that they cannot actually govern a nation with just soldiers and bureaucrats.
Right.
They need a political party, which raises a really important question: why? I mean, why is the machinery of a nation, regardless of whether it's a vibrant democracy or a repressive autocracy, completely unable to function without a political party?
And that, right there, is exactly the mystery we are unpacking today. We are doing a deep dive into a really comprehensive political science text that pulls back the curtain on this entire concept of parties.
And we aren't just looking at the surface level platforms or, the daily news cycle.
No, we are getting into the invisible, mathematical, and structural forces that dictate how these organizations control governments worldwide. We are going to decode the hidden operating system of democracy.
Yeah, we'll be exploring the fundamental mechanics of why parties are a necessary structural component, how the invisible rules of an electoral game dictate whether a country has 2 parties or 8, and looking at the modern reality where these massive organizations might actually just be evolving into corporate lifestyle brands.
Now, before we really jump into the gears of this machine, I want to make a crucial note for you listening.
Yes, very important.
Our source material today covers an enormous amount of ground. We are looking at historical and political movements across the globe. We'll be discussing communist regimes, the Tea Party, the coalitions of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama.
It's a huge spectrum.
It is. But we're looking at all of this strictly through the cold, objective lens of political science mechanics.
Right. We are entirely impartial here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing any political viewpoints left, right, or center. Our mission today is simply to unpack the textbook's analysis of how the political machinery actually operates, regardless of who is pulling the levers.
It's about the physics of the system, not the morality of the players.
Beautifully put. Okay, let's unpack this. If we are going to spend this deep dive critiquing and analyzing political parties, we first have to understand the fundamental mechanics of why they exist in the first place.
Right, the baseline function.
And the text refers to the party as an inputting device.
To really grasp what an inputting device is in this context, you have to imagine the sheer scale of a modern nation-state.
It's massive.
Exactly. Think about the relationship between one single human being and the colossal, sprawling machinery of a national government. Without a political party, that individual citizen stands entirely alone.
An alone individual trying to get the attention of the state? I mean, you might as well be whispering into a hurricane.
That's a great way to put it. It's just noise. The government cannot process the isolated demands of millions of disconnected individuals.
So the party acts as a bridge. It's an aggregator of voices. By working within or voting for a party, citizens essentially get a standardized input mechanism.
Right.
They get a structured channel to have their needs actually processed by the state.
And that channel provides something vital: efficacy. It's the belief that your actions can actually influence the system.
So feeling like you actually matter.
Exactly. At the absolute bare minimum, parties give people the feeling that they are not completely powerless. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, that feeling of efficacy is exactly why those military dictatorships we mentioned earlier eventually needed to create parties.
Because a state can't survive just by threatening people forever.
Exactly. The friction is just too high. It needs a baseline of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Giving the populace a party to belong to, even if that party is entirely rigged by the state, it provides a psychological anchor. It makes the citizen feel like they are part of the process, which stabilizes the regime.
I keep visualizing this as the operating system of a computer.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, like the government itself is the raw hardware, the processors, the memory, the electricity. We might absolutely hate the user interface of the operating system. We might hate the bloatware, the glitches, the forced updates.
Right, the endless updates.
But without that operating system, you just have a bunch of random hardware components uselessly burning electricity. You can't actually run any programs without the OS acting as the middleman between the user and the hardware.
Taking that operating system analogy further, think about all the different software programs trying to run at once. In a society, those are your interest groups.
Okay, like who?
Well, you have union workers demanding better wages. You have agricultural lobbies wanting crop subsidies, environmentalists pushing for regulations, corporate lobbyists fighting for tax breaks.
That is a lot of competing software.
It is. And if every single one of those interest groups fought independently on the national stage, the government would just crash. It would be utter chaos. One group would endlessly slug it out with another to sway individual government officials.
So nothing would actually get done.
Right. There would be no overarching policy, just a constant, chaotic war of attrition.
Wait, hold on though. The text brings up this concept of interest aggregation as the solution to that chaos. But you're saying environmentalists and corporate lobbyists or, labor unions and management are supposed to just sit under the same party umbrella.
That's the idea, yeah.
But how does that not immediately result in a massive internal fistfight?
Oh, well, it often does result in internal fights, but that is the genius of interest aggregation. Parties act as an enormous umbrella, yes. They pull together these separate, often fiercely competing interest groups into a single, larger organization capable of winning an election.
Okay, but there has to be a catch.
There is a steep cost for the interest groups to get under that umbrella. They are forced to moderate their demands.
Because if they demand 100% of what they want, they alienate the other groups under the umbrella.
Exactly.
And then the coalition shatters, the party loses the election, and nobody gets anything.
Precisely. To achieve the collective goal of holding power, the union has to compromise with the environmentalist, who has to compromise with the corporate donor. They have to cooperate.
That makes total sense. And the text gives some brilliant historical examples of this aggregation in action. Like, look at the Democratic Party coalition that Franklin D. Roosevelt built in the 1930s.
That's a classic example.
He aggregated an incredibly disparate group. You had northern factory workers, southern farmers, newly arrived ethnic minorities, and intellectuals.
Groups that historically had very little in common.
Right. But labor unions, by working within that massive Democratic Party, achieved sweeping labor legislation that they never could have passed if they were just an independent labor party fighting all alone.
But they had to share the umbrella. They had to support agricultural policies they might not have cared about at all, simply to keep the Southern farmers in the coalition.
And as long as that coalition held together, they were mathematically unbeatable. I mean, they won the presidency 5 times in a row.
Yeah. It's incredibly powerful when it works. And the text notes that Ronald Reagan pulled off a very similar masterclass in interest aggregation for the Republicans in the 1980s.
How did he do it?
He successfully aggregated wealthy economic conservatives who primarily cared about, tax cuts and deregulation with working-class, non-economic social conservatives.
And those two groups have very, very different primary motivations.
Completely different. But the party provided the structure for them to aggregate their votes to actually win power. We saw it again with Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012.
Right, aggregating younger voters, women, and diverse minority groups into a winning coalition.
Exactly. The underlying mechanism there is reciprocity. Each separate interest group realizes it can only accomplish a fraction of its goals if it cooperates with other groups, hoping the favor is returned down the line.
It's transactional, but it stabilizes the country. And the textbook points out another vital function that stabilizes the country: integration and socialization.
Yes, this is huge.
Because parties don't just organize the people who are already powerful,
Yeah.
right? They actively pull marginalized groups into the system.
And this is a crucial self-preservation mechanism for a democracy. Parties actively seek out marginalized or newly arrived groups and welcome them, giving them a tangible say in the party platform.
Why do they do that? Just for the votes?
Well, yes, for the votes. But the systemic reason is simple. It gives those groups a pragmatic and psychological stake in the existing system. The text uses the historical example of the British Labour Party and the U.S. Democratic Party integrating industrial workers back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Because the Industrial Revolution had created pretty brutal conditions.
Very brutal. And there was a very real threat of radical, violent, revolutionary labor movements. I mean, we saw exactly that happen in Russia.
But by pulling those workers into the formal political process, by fighting for union rights and fair labor practices within the actual halls of Parliament and Congress, the parties essentially took a revolutionary movement and made it moderate.
Exactly, because once you actually have a seat at the negotiating table, you don't really want to burn the building down anymore. You become invested in the survival of the political system itself.
And that integration leads directly to socialization. I love this part. The party literally teaches people how to be political citizens.
Historically, yes. Look at New York's Tammany Hall political machine in the 1800s.
Oh yeah, the classic machine politics.
Right. You had European immigrants arriving off the boats, often speaking no English, facing immense prejudice, completely disconnected from the state. And the Tammany Hall ward bosses would welcome them, help them find a job, maybe secure housing or, coal for the winter.
And in return?
In return, they simply asked the immigrant to enroll and vote as a Democrat.
Which isn't just a political transaction, really. It creates this generational, enduring bond, which leads to what the text calls party ID, partisan identification.
And party ID is so much deeper than people realize.
Yeah, the text points out that it isn't just about what box you check on a voter registration form when you turn 18. It is a deep psychological attachment. It's much closer to like a religious affiliation or a loyalty to a hometown sports team, and it forms incredibly early in childhood.
Right. Children absorb these partisan values from their parents at the dinner table, long before they have the cognitive ability to understand tax brackets or foreign policy.
They just learn we are this type of people.
Exactly. And this party ID provides massive continuity to a political system. Think about it. In a country without strong parties, when a charismatic leader leaves office or dies, the voters just scatter to the wind and the system can collapse into a power vacuum.
But because of party ID, voters generally transfer their support to the next candidate wearing that party's label, so the system remains stable.
And crucially, the party gets them off the couch. Mobilization. The text makes a really stark point here. Weak parties equal low voter turnout.
Because national politics is incredibly complex. If citizens were forced to independently research every nuanced policy position of every individual candidate without any labels to guide them, the cognitive load would just be way too high.
Most people would just tune out and ignore elections entirely. Parties simplify the complex issues into digestible, binary alternatives.
The text highlights Sweden here, which is fascinating. In Sweden, where strong, highly organized, dues-paying political parties operate, they have historically driven voter turnout to an astonishing 90%.
Yeah, 90% is incredible.
Yeah.
When you compare that to the much lower turnout in the United States, you really see the power of organizational mobilization.
The text highlights a famous assertion by the political scientist E. Schutzschneider. He said, "Political parties created democracy. Modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties."
And he wasn't praising their moral character there. He was arguing that they are the very engines that make the mechanics of democracy function.
So we've established the necessity of the operating system. We see why the hardware needs it. But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction that honestly, every listener has likely felt.
The frustration with the system.
Exactly. If parties exist to serve voters, to aggregate our interests, to integrate us into the system, why do they so often feel entirely disconnected from what the public actually wants? I mean, why does it constantly feel like the operating system is completely ignoring the user?
That frustration is exactly what neo-institutional theory attempts to explain.
Neo-institutional theory. Break that down for us.
Well, in classical democratic theory, a party is essentially just a reflection of its voters.
Right.
If a party adopts an unpopular platform and ignores the voters, it will lose the election.
Right, it's a marketplace.
Exactly. The pain of losing will force the party to realize its mistake, change its tune, adopt popular policies, and try again. It's supposed to be a self-correcting market of ideas.
But neo-institutional theory says the market is broken.
It suggests that institutions and political parties are massive institutions can take on a life entirely their own. Over decades, a party develops strong internal traditions, bureaucracies, and entrenched leadership structures.
It becomes incredibly self-absorbed.
Yes, the party can become so intensely focused on the power struggles, the ideological debates, and the career ladder inside the organization that they completely lose sight of the voters outside the organization.
So the party essentially becomes victims of its own internal echo chamber.
Precisely.
It makes me think of an incredibly talented, wildly successful indie band.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Right, so over time, the band members get older, they get wealthy, they isolate themselves in the recording studio, and they just stop caring about what the audience wants to hear. They become totally obsessed with their own obscure experimental B-sides.
They lose touch with their base.
Exactly. They go on tour, and instead of playing the hits that made people buy tickets in the first place, they play like 20-minute avant-garde jazz solos. The audience is literally walking out of the arena, but the band members are on stage looking at each other, convinced they are creating pure art, and the audience just doesn't get it.
That is exactly the dynamic. The party, as an institution, decouples its behavior from its primary external objective, winning elections, and instead focuses on winning internal ideological arguments.
And the textbook provides 3 incredibly dramatic historical case studies of this phenomenon where parties essentially committed electoral suicide because they refused to play the hits.
Yes. Let's walk through those case studies because the mechanics of how a massive political organization crashes and burns are just fascinating.
The first one the text points to is Britain.
Right, the British Labour Party in the 1980s and early 90s. For a long period, the Labour Party retreated completely into itself. It was dominated by its more radical union and activist wings.
And what kind of policies were they pushing?
They adopted economic policies, like the mass nationalization of industry and unilateral nuclear disarmament, that were deeply popular inside the party conferences.
But outside the conferences.
Electorally, vastly too far left for the average British swing voter. They were ideologically pure, and they felt incredibly righteous about their stances, but they were unviable.
So what happened?
Because of this stubborn refusal to adapt, they lost 4 consecutive national elections to the Conservatives, 4 in a row.
Ouch.
It wasn't until the internal pain of losing finally outweighed the desire for ideological purity that they completely rebranded. They moderated, moved toward the center, called themselves New Labour under Tony Blair in 1997, and finally won again.
They finally agreed to play the hits, but the second example in the text, the Canadian case study, is so much more extreme.
Oh, the Canadian example is legendary in political science.
This is the story of Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives in the early 1990s. Walk us through how a party basically evaporates overnight.
So, to set the stage, in 1984, the Canadian Progressive Conservatives, the PC Party, won the largest majority in Canadian history. They were an absolute juggernaut.
They had a massive mandate.
Yes. But under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, the party leadership became totally insulated. They pushed through a deeply unpopular new national sales tax and heavily promoted the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA.
And the timing wasn't great either, right?
Terrible timing. Simultaneously, Canada entered a severe recession. Unemployment was climbing, and the public was absolutely furious.
But the PC leadership just put their fingers in their ears.
Completely. They were convinced of their own neo-institutional righteousness. They believed their economic policies were structurally correct, and that the voters would eventually somehow thank them. They stubbornly refused to change course or even acknowledge the public's pain. Mulroney's personal approval ratings dropped into the single digits, which, honestly, is almost mathematically impossible for a sitting leader.
So what did he do?
Eventually, recognizing the impending disaster, Mulroney resigned very late in the game. He essentially handed the controls of a nosediving airplane over to his successor, Kim Campbell, who became Canada's first female prime minister.
But she was basically just a sacrificial lamb at that point.
Completely.
So what happens in the 1993 election? How bad is the crash?
It was absolute obliteration.
Uh-huh.
The Progressive Conservative Party went from a governing majority of over 150 seats down to 2 seats.
2 seats. From controlling the entire national agenda to, like, 2 guys sharing a single taxi to Parliament.
Yes.
That isn't just a loss. That is the voters actively trying to erase the party from existence.
Exactly. And the third example the text highlights is Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
The LDP was dominant for a long time, right?
Decades. They had a virtual monopoly on Japanese politics following World War II. But in the 1990s, Japan's asset bubble burst, and they entered an agonizing decade-long economic slump.
And the public wanted change.
The public demanded structural reform, but the LDP was entirely paralyzed by its own neo-institutional structure. The party was divided into fierce internal factions run by powerful bosses.
So they were fighting each other instead of fixing the economy.
Right. These factions blocked each other from doing anything meaningful. They were so focused on their internal power balance that they just ignored the dying economy. They assumed they would always be reelected because Japanese voters historically favored stability over change.
But eventually, the voters had enough.
Exactly. The sheer incompetence broke the voters' patience. In a series of elections, the voters stripped the LDP of its power, ultimately booting them out entirely in 2009 in favor of the opposition.
So when a party suffers a crushing, humiliating loss, whether it's 4 in a row in Britain or going down to 2 seats in Canada, what actually happens inside the room the morning after the election, how does the party process that trauma?
That is where the neo-institutional friction sparks into open warfare.
I can imagine.
When a massive party loses, an inevitable internal debate breaks out, dividing the party into 2 fierce camps. On one side, you have the ideological purists.
And what's their argument?
They will stand up and argue, we didn't lose because our ideas were too extreme. We lost because our message wasn't clear enough. We weren't pure enough to excite our true base. The voters couldn't tell us apart from the other guys.
Right. The indie band members saying the audience didn't leave because the 20-minute jazz solo was bad. They left because the acoustics in the arena ruined our genius.
Yes, perfect. And on the other side of the room, you have the moderates, the pragmatists.
What do they say?
They will shout back. We lost because you purists terrify the independent centrist voters. Elections are just math, and the math is in the middle. We have to moderate to win.
And who usually wins that fight?
It varies, but the winner of that internal battle dictates the entire future trajectory of the party. And sometimes the friction is so intense that the loser of that internal fight simply walks out, splinters off, and forms a brand new party, which is exactly what contributed to the fallout in both Canada and Japan.
So if decentralization and internal factionalism can cause a party to march straight off a cliff, it begs the question who's actually holding the leash. I mean, how much control does the leadership actually have over the politicians wearing their brand?
That brings us to the control room of political parties. The text outlines the architecture of power, specifically focusing on centralization and discipline.
Right, let's look at the control room.
This is where we see how the structural rules of an electoral game dictate human behavior. Let's look at the absolute extreme of highly centralized systems first. The purest example in the text is Israel.
Okay, how does Israel do it?
Israel uses a system of proportional representation, where the entire country is treated as one single massive district. There are no local geographical representatives. Instead, each political party draws up a single party list of 120 nominees for their parliament, the Knesset.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this. As a voter in Israel, I don't go to the ballot box and vote for a specific local candidate from my neighborhood.
No, you do not.
So what am I looking at on the ballot?
You look at the ballot and you vote for the party brand itself. You vote for the list. Now, here is where the tremendous centralization of power lies. The top party chiefs, sitting in a room, dictate the exact order of the names on that list.
Okay.
So if the party wins enough national votes to secure 20 seats in the Knesset, the first 20 people on that pre-written list get the jobs. The person at number 21 gets nothing.
Oh, wow. So if I am a politician in Israel, my entire career, my livelihood, my relevance depends entirely on where a handful of party bosses put my name on that piece of paper. There is no local primary election where I can, go win over my hometown voters to save my job.
Exactly. There is no local safety net. And think about the behavior that structure incentivizes.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to step out of line.
Exactly. If you are sitting in the Knesset and you decide to rebel against the party leadership on a key vote because your conscience dictates it, the party bosses don't even have to formally fire you.
What do?
They just quietly move your name from a safe spot at number 15 on the list down to number 115 for the next election. Your political career is instantly, silently terminated.
Man, that is ruthless.
The result of this architecture is absolute, ironclad party discipline. When the leader speaks, the entire party votes as a single, unified, unbreakable bloc.
That is the ultimate top-down control. Okay, what about the middle ground?
We see semi-centralized systems in places like Britain and Germany. It's not absolute control, but it's close.
How does Britain work?
In Britain, candidate selection is a negotiation. The National Party headquarters might suggest a rising star for a specific local district, but the local constituency party committee has to officially approve them.
And Germany.
Germany also uses party lists, but they are decentralized across their 16 states, which diffuses the power of the national chiefs just a bit. But in both systems, the national party still holds enough leverage to maintain very strong, cohesive party discipline on the parliament floor.
And then we have the United States.
Yes, the United States is the global outlier.
It really is.
It is an incredibly decentralized, almost chaotic system by comparison.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text notes that because of how the U.S. uses direct primary elections, candidates essentially have to build their own brand new personal party organization every single time they run.
Yes, they're basically independent operators.
Right. They hire their own consultants, they raise their own money locally, they produce and run their own television commercials, which increasingly might not even mention whether the candidate is a Democrat or a Republican until the final second.
Because they act as independent political entrepreneurs, they owe the National Party very little.
Which changes everything about how they vote.
Exactly. Imagine a U.S. senator in a contentious state. The president, who belongs to the same party, calls them and demands their vote on a crucial, controversial bill.
Okay, what does the senator do?
That senator could look at the president and say, with all due respect, I don't owe you anything. The National Party didn't fund my campaign. My local donors did. The National Party didn't knock on doors for me. My local volunteers did.
And voting for your bill will make me lose my primary back home.
Precisely. So I am voting no. The National Party has almost no architectural leverage to force them into line.
Which explains phenomenons like the Blue Dog Democrats, more conservative Democrats from rural areas who would frequently cross the aisle and vote with Republicans?
Yes. Or politicians who just switch parties entirely right in the middle of their term, like Senators Jim Jeffords or Arlen Specter.
The National Party couldn't really punish them.
No, they couldn't. And the text points out this extreme decentralization creates modern fractures. Look at the Tea Party movement within the Republican Party during the Obama years.
That was a huge shift.
You had a situation where a sitting Republican majority leader, Eric Cantor, one of the most powerful men in Washington, lost his primary election to a virtually unknown, underfunded challenger named Dave Bratt.
I remember that. It sent shockwaves through Washington.
Right, because the national Republican machinery desperately wanted to protect Cantor, but they were powerless against a localized grassroots uprising.
And we cannot discuss U.S. decentralization without discussing the primary fuel that runs that localized engine: money.
Oh, absolutely. Money is the driver.
Campaign finance is a universal disease in democracies, but the sheer scale of it in the decentralized U.S. system is just staggering.
Yes. The text notes that in the 2012 U.S. elections, a combined $6.5 billion was spent.
And that is an older figure. It doesn't even account for the massive, opaque pools of dark money funneled through super PACs today.
Contrast that $6.5 billion with the British general elections around the same time. The text notes the British spent only about $150 million total.
That is a wild difference. $6.5 billion versus $150 million. Why is it so different?
The difference is structural. Many European democracies use public government funds to subsidize political parties, granting them free television airtime based on their vote share.
So they don't have to constantly beg for cash.
Exactly. It drastically reduces the party's reliance on private, wealthy donors.
But the U.S. attempted to create a similar system, right? To curb the influence of wealth.
They did try, yes. The $3 tax checkoff box on your IRS returns to publicly fund presidential campaigns.
Right. I've seen that on the forums.
But it failed miserably. Too few taxpayers opted in, and the torrent of private money available through decentralized PACs and super PACs was just too massive for any candidate to voluntarily ignore.
So they opted out of the public system to chase the private billions.
Precisely. They couldn't afford not to.
Okay, I want to step in and push back here for a second on behalf of the listener.
Sure, go ahead.
The text cites E.E. Schachtschneider again, who looked at this decentralized U.S. system and called it a punching bag for every special and local interest in the nation.
Right, who clearly despised how weak the U.S. parties were.
But from a voter's perspective, doesn't European-style party discipline just mean politicians are forced to act like mindless robots for the party bosses?
That is the common critique, yes.
Isn't the U.S. way where A local politician is free to vote their conscience and represent the specific, unique needs of their local district over the demands of the national elite. Isn't that actually much more democratic?
That is a phenomenal counterargument. And it brings us to a core debate in political science surrounding a concept called responsible party government.
Responsible party government. Break down how that works against the U.S. model.
It comes down to a single word: accountability.
Accountability, okay.
In a European parliamentary system with strong centralized party discipline, the winning party holds all the levers of power simultaneously.
Right, they control everything.
They control the executive branch, the prime minister, and they have an absolute disciplined majority in the legislative branch. So if that ruling party runs a campaign promising to fix the healthcare system and they win, they mathematically have the votes to pass whatever healthcare bill they want.
Because nobody in their party is going to vote against it.
Exactly. Therefore, if the healthcare system fails or the economy crashes, the voters know exactly 100% who is to blame. The ruling party cannot make excuses. They cannot point fingers. They are wholly, undeniably accountable.
They own the failure.
Exactly. But now look at the United States with its weak party discipline and strict separation of powers. Accountability is incredibly murky.
Yeah, you constantly have divided government.
You might have a Democratic president, but a Republican-controlled House of Representatives and a Senate that is split 50-50, where individual maverick senators from both sides are constantly defecting based on the localized needs of their home states.
So it's a massive web of veto points.
Yes. So when a major campaign promise is broken or a crisis occurs, who is actually to blame?
Right. Is it the president's fault?
Or is it the opposition party obstructing in the House? Is it the two defecting senators from the president's own party? The voters simply don't know who to punish at the ballot box. Every side blames the other.
That makes total sense. So while a decentralized system absolutely provides better, granular local representation, the theory of responsible party government argues that it completely sacrifices national accountability.
Exactly. The system becomes so complex that the voters can no longer clearly assign blame.
It's like trying to fire someone for a failed project in a heavily matrixed corporate management structure. Nobody actually knows whose fault it was because everyone had a hand in it, so nobody gets fired.
That's a perfect analogy.
Okay, so we've thoroughly covered the structure, the discipline, the control rooms. That is the vehicle. But ideology is the destination. What are they actually organizing for? Let's map out what these parties actually stand for and then look at the absolute ultimate extreme of party ideology.
To clearly map the modern ideological spectrum, the textbook uses Sweden's unicameral parliament, the Riksdag, as the perfect, complete model.
Why Sweden?
Because Sweden uses proportional representation, they don't force everyone into two massive tents. They have a wide array of distinct parties spanning from the far left to the far right, allowing us to see the exact gradations of political ideology.
Let's walk across that Swedish spectrum from left to right. What do these labels actually mean in practice?
Starting on the far left, you have the Left Party. Historically, this party has roots in Euro-communism or aggressive socialism. While they've modernized, they generally favor heavy state intervention, higher taxation on wealth, and occasionally the nationalization of key industries.
Okay, moving one step toward the middle.
You find the center left, the Social Democrats. They are the historic architects of the Swedish system.
And how do they differ from the far left?
Well, a center-left party generally accepts capitalism and the free market. They don't want the government to own the car factories, but they want to heavily tax the wealth generated by those factories to fiercely defend a robust, expansive welfare state, universal health care, free education, strong pensions.
Right, capitalism, but with a strong safety net.
Moving along, you also have the Green Party, whose ideology is primarily focused on ecology and climate action, often allying with the center-left.
And as we cross over the center line,
You find the truly centrist parties, like the Center Party and the Liberals. These parties are fascinating because they often blend ideologies. They're usually very socially liberal regarding human rights, but lean toward free market conservative economics.
okay, continuing right.
Moving further right, you find the Christian Democrats, who emphasize traditional family values alongside market economics. Then you hit the traditional center-right, the moderates.
What is the primary goal of the center right in a European system?
A center-right party generally argues that the welfare state has grown too bloated and inefficient. They don't want to dismantle it entirely. They aren't anarcho-capitalists, but they want to rein in taxes, privatize certain state services, and promote free enterprise to spur economic growth.
And finally, on the far right.
Finally, on the far right of the Riksdag, you have the Sweden Democrats. The text characterizes them as a nationalist, populist party whose primary ideological driver is anti-immigration and skepticism of international bodies like the European Union.
That gives you a really clean menu. A voter can pinpoint exactly how much welfare state or free market they want.
Yes, it's very precise.
But the text takes a massive detour here to examine what it calls the communist exception. Because communist parties, historically, didn't operate on this left-to-right spectrum like normal democratic parties. They were something else entirely.
Yes, the textbook dives deeply into the classic monolithic model founded by Vladimir Lenin and brutally developed by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union.
Right.
This is the ultimate extreme of a centralized one-party system. But what's crucial to understand about the Soviet architecture is that the Communist Party didn't technically, legally, rule the country directly.
Wait, really? The text describes this dual hat system. Explain how that worked.
It was a parallel shadow organization. The party supervised, monitored, and controlled the actual formal state government from behind the curtain.
So the government on paper was basically just a shell company.
Exactly. So, on paper, the Soviet Union had a government legislature, just like a Western democracy. It was called the Supreme Soviet. They passed the laws. But corresponding to it, in the shadows, was the Communist Party's Central Committee.
And what did the Central Committee do?
The Central Committee actually nominated all the candidates who were quote-unquote elected to the Supreme Soviet, and they secretly dictated all the legislative outcomes before the votes ever happened.
Here's how I visualize this. The Soviet system wasn't just a government. It was like a shadow corporate board of directors pulling the strings of a puppet, wearing a legitimate state government like a cheap suit to fool the international community.
Taking that analogy further, above the Central Committee was the ultimate boardroom, the Politburo. This was a tiny group of a dozen or so top party leaders, guided by the General Secretary, who held absolute, terrifying power over the entire vast empire.
But the text poses a vital question here. If a single party achieves that level of absolute suffocating control, penetrating the military, the schools, the factories, why did this monolithic, seemingly invincible system completely collapse in 1991?
Right, it's a great question.
Because intuitively, if you have that much control, if you have the secret police and the military, you should be able to hold on to power forever.
You would think so. But the text points to the tragic realization of Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. He realized this system was rotting from the inside out.
Rotting.
Think about the incentive structure. When one single party controls all the best jobs, the best apartments, access to special grocery stores, and foreign travel, what kind of people join that party?
Opportunists, people who don't actually care about Marxist ideology, they just want a nice apartment.
Exactly. The party fills up with corrupt apparatchiks. These are full-time, entrenched party functionaries who only care about preserving their own privilege.
Makes sense.
Over decades, this class of apparatchiks becomes incredibly conservative. Not conservative in the ideological sense of wanting free markets, but conservative in the literal sense. They aggressively refuse to change the system that benefits them.
They fiercely resist any reform, innovation, or efficiency because it might threaten their cushy job.
Right. They don't want to rock the boat that they are currently dining on.
So how did Gorbachev try to fix it?
He realized this suffocating rot was destroying the Soviet economy, which was falling hopelessly, embarrassingly behind the West in technology and living standards. He tried to break the Communist Party's monopoly.
With glasnost and perestroika, right?
Yes, he tried to introduce small democratic reforms and openness to save the country. But he tragically underestimated how brittle the neo-institutional structure had become. It was like a termite-eaten house.
So what happened when he opened the door?
The moment he removed the absolute monopoly on power, the entire structure collapsed under its own weight.
It's a fascinating contrast to China, which the textbook also brings up. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, watched the Soviet collapse happen in real time next door, and they took a completely different lesson from it.
A very different lesson.
They decided that Gorbachev's mistake was loosening political control. So the CCP decided to retain absolute, ruthless political monopoly, but they completely abandoned strict Marxist economics.
Yes.
They allowed massive private enterprise, capitalism, and even started officially admitting billionaire business persons into the Communist Party just to ensure the party's economic survival.
It's a staggering ideological pivot. The vanguard of the proletariat actively recruiting billionaires. And whether that hybrid authoritarian capitalist model can survive in the long term, especially as China's middle class grows massive and begins demanding more political accountability, remains one of the great open questions in modern political science.
But the core lesson the textbook derives from the Soviet collapse is clear. Single-party monopolies are mathematically doomed to rot over the long term. Without the invigorating, cleansing elements of open debate, political competition, and public accountability, they inevitably become inflexible, corrupt, and ultimately brittle.
And the text doesn't just theorize this, it grounds it in hard data with some really interesting cross-tabulations. They map out a country's wealth, specifically its per capita gross domestic product, against its Freedom House ranking.
Yes, Freedom House.
Right, Freedom House is an organization that ranks countries globally on a scale of 1 to 7 regarding their political rights and civil liberties. A score of 1 means a highly free, robust democracy, and a 7 represents a highly repressive autocracy.
So what does the data show?
When the textbook cross-tabulates that freedom score with national wealth, a very clear, undeniable general rule emerges. Rich countries are almost universally free democracies, and poor countries are generally autocracies.
But the textbook notes that the real political science insight isn't in the rule itself. It's in the anomalies, the outliers that defy the math.
Precisely. Let's look at India.
Okay, what about India?
India is historically a relatively poor country in terms of per capita GDP, given its massive population. According to the data trend, it should struggle with authoritarianism. But India is a highly robust, functioning democracy.
Why is that?
The textbook attributes this anomaly directly to the historical, long-term stabilizing development of India's Congress Party, which embedded deep democratic habits and electoral expectations into the cultural fabric over decades.
Fascinating. And on the flip side?
On the flip side of the data, look at Russia. In the 2000s, Russia's national wealth climbed significantly due to a massive influx of oil and gas revenue. According to the trend, they should have become more free. But their Freedom House rating actually sank further toward autocracy.
Because wealth alone doesn't magically create democracy if the underlying institutions are broken.
Exactly. The wealth did not buy freedom there because the historical institutions and the political culture did not support democratic competition.
So ideologies and structures don't exist in a vacuum. They have to survive in a competitive environment. Which brings us to how we classify the ecosystems these parties operate in. Let's count the players on the field.
Right, classifying the systems.
We've seen the absolute extremes. Let's look at the whole menu of party systems globally.
The simplest, most effective way to classify these diverse ecosystems is simply by counting how many parties actually have a realistic chance of wielding power. We just extensively discussed one-party systems like the Soviet Union and China.
But it's worth noting, as the text carefully does, that historically, some developing nations, particularly in post-colonial Africa, attempted to justify one-party rule by arguing that multi-party competition would simply devolve into violent tribal or ethnic conflict.
Right. They argued a single party was necessary for national unity.
A structural justification for authoritarianism. Okay, stepping down from total monopoly, we have dominant party systems.
In a dominant party system, opposition parties are entirely legal. They exist, they run candidates, they campaign. But the deck is completely structurally stacked against them.
How so?
The dominant party controls the state media, they control the distribution of government jobs, they manage the lucrative contracts. India's Congress Party operated exactly like this for decades after independence.
And Japan's LDP, which we discussed earlier, was a dominant party.
Yes. Mexico's PRI ruled continuously for most of the 20th century, using patronage and state resources to win every election, until the opposition PAN party's Vicente Fox finally broke the streak in 2000. And today, the textbook points out that Vladimir Putin's United Russia operates effectively as a dominant party.
And then we get to the two-party systems, which listeners in the U.S. and Britain are intimately familiar with. Two massive, lumbering giants trade power back and forth. Third parties technically exist on the ballot, but they almost never win national office.
Though they rarely win seats, the textbook heavily emphasizes that third parties in these systems are not useless. They are crucial idea generators.
They act as a vital warning light on the dashboard of the democracy.
Exactly. If a fringe third party starts rapidly gaining traction and stealing votes, it forces one of the two big parties to adapt. The giant party will absorb the third party's ideas to survive and win back those voters.
Moving on from the duopoly, we have the multi-party systems. We talked about Sweden and Israel. Having half a dozen parties is sometimes criticized as being inherently unstable, right?
It can be. The text uses a great term, immobilism. getting completely stuck and unable to govern because you can't get 5 different parties to agree on a budget.
But the text also notes they can be highly effective.
Yes, the effectiveness of a multi-party system relies entirely on the political culture of the nation and the willingness of the party leaders to compromise and form stable governing coalitions. In Scandinavia, there is a strong cultural consensus around cooperation, so multi-party systems thrive.
But recently, political scientists are seeing a trend toward a hybrid model, what the text calls 2+ system.
Right.
2+, that sounds like a tier on a streaming service subscription.
It practically is. In a 2+ system, you have 2 dominant large parties that win the vast majority of the vote, but there is 1 or maybe 2 smaller, highly relevant third parties that consistently win just enough seats to deny anyone an absolute majority.
So they act as kingmakers.
Exactly. Germany is a great example of this. Austria is another, with their right-wing Freedom Party often acting as the plus needed to form a government. Even Britain is functionally transitioning to a 2+ system, given the enduring influence of the centrist Liberal Democrats and regional powers like the Scottish nationalists.
And the final category is the messy one, fluid or inchoate systems.
Incho is a wonderful term. It simply means not yet fully formed or organized. These are chaotic systems where political parties are incredibly fragile and temporary. They rise to massive popularity and collapse into obscurity overnight.
What causes that?
They're usually built entirely around a single, highly charismatic personality rather than an enduring written ideology. We see this frequently in Latin American democracies or in post-Soviet Eastern Europe during the Wild West of the 1990s.
The text notes that Putin's Unity Party in 1999 was essentially an inchoate, personalistic vehicle created out of thin air just in time for an election, which he then, over time, morphed into a formidable, dominant party. So, looking across all these diverse systems, from the dominance of Mexico's PRI to the fragile inchoate parties in the 90s, what does this all mean for the baseline corruption of a state?
That's a crucial question.
Because the text explicitly notes that in dominant party systems where competition is smothered, friends of the leaders inevitably end up stashing millions in foreign bank accounts. If dominant parties inevitably get corrupt due to lack of friction, is a messy, noisy, hyper-competitive, multi-party system the only effective disinfectant?
The textbook argues strongly that yes, competitive, aggressive party systems are the primary immune response to corruption. Think about the incentives.
Right, if you're the opposition.
An out-party, the opposition, has a massive existential incentive to aggressively investigate and hammer away at every alleged corruption scandal of the in-party. It doesn't cure human corruption entirely, of course, but the terrifying fear of losing the next election keeps the ruling class in check.
A single party that locks itself in power without the threat of a competitive opposition inevitably rots. And when we talk about that competition, we absolutely have to mention Giovanni Sartori's concept of a relevant party, because this concept completely changed how I view elections.
Sartori is a giant in political science.
Yeah, because you do not actually have to win a single election to be one of the most powerful forces in a country.
No, you do not.
Yeah.
Sartori argues that a party is relevant if the major parties have to alter their fundamental behavior or platform to address them, even if that third party wins literally 0 seats in parliament.
The text gives some incredible U.S. examples here to prove the point. The Dixiecrats in 1948 or George Wallace's American Independent Party in 1968 mathematically lost, but they forced the major parties to radically change their campaign strategies regarding civil rights.
Exactly.
John Anderson's independent run in 1980 forced Jimmy Carter to talk about environmental and centrist issues he desperately wanted to ignore.
Ross Perot, in 1992, running on charts and graphs, forced both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton to suddenly focus heavily on the federal budget deficit.
And Ralph Nader in 2000 absolutely altered the ideological trajectory of the Democratic Party regarding corporate power and environmentalism. Every single one of them was a loser mathematically. But they were all highly relevant parties because they generated enough gravitational pull to force the giant, lumbering two parties to pivot.
Which perfectly illustrates how these political ecosystems respond to pressure. But the ultimate shape of that ecosystem, whether you have 2 giants or a dozen small, agile parties, isn't an accident of history. It is dictated entirely by the underlying mathematics of the election itself.
Yes. This is my favorite part of the text, the invisible mechanics. We've seen countries with 2 parties and countries with 8, and the textbook makes it very, very clear. It is not about national culture or personality.
Swedes aren't just genetically more agreeable to having 8 parties than Americans.
Right. It's entirely about the invisible mathematical rules of the electoral game.
This mathematical framework is perhaps the single most important institutional choice a country ever makes. Let's look at the 2 main models that dominate the globe.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is single-member districts, which is also commonly known as first past the post, or FPTP. This is the system used by the United States, Britain, and Canada.
First past the post. So you divide the country into districts. Each district gets one single seat in the legislature. Whoever gets the most votes, even if it's just a plurality, not a majority, wins the entire seat. Simple.
It is brilliantly simple to understand, but it has profound, society-altering structural consequences. FPTP mathematically enforces a 2-party system.
Why?
Because in a winner-take-all scenario, splitting your ideological vote is fatal.
To explain this, the text uses the legendary historical example of Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 U.S. presidential election.
Yes, it is the perfect case study.
Walk us through it.
Teddy Roosevelt, a wildly popular, charismatic former Republican president, decides he wants his old job back. But the Republican Party establishment backs the incumbent, William Howard Taft.
So Roosevelt, frustrated, breaks away and runs as a third-party candidate, the Progressive Bull Moose Party.
Exactly. And what is the result? Roosevelt and Taft split the conservative and moderate vote right down the middle. Because of that structural split, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, wins the presidency with a mere 41% plurality of the popular vote.
The lesson the American political parties learned that night is permanent. You cannot split your coalition. No matter how much you might despise the other factions inside your own party, if you splinter off, you will guarantee total victory for your worst ideological enemy.
So FKTP forces everyone to grit their teeth, swallow their pride, and stay inside a massive, uncomfortable 2-party tent.
The mathematics demand consolidation. Now contrast that with the alternative. Proportional representation, or PR. PR throws out the single-seat map.
Yes, it uses multi-member districts. Instead of one person winning a small local district, a massive regional district might elect 10 or 20 representatives at once. And crucially, the seats are assigned based on the total percentage of the vote a party receives.
Okay, let me make sure the math checks out. If there are 100 seats available and my brand new environmental party gets exactly 10% of the total national vote, we get exactly 10 seats in the parliament.
Correct. And this mathematical shift completely changes the behavioral incentive structure for the politicians and the voters. PR actively encourages parties to split.
Because if a specific faction gets angry at the mainstream party leadership, they don't have to worry about the Teddy Roosevelt spoiler effect.
Exactly. They can break away, form a highly specific new party, win just 5% or 8% of the vote, and still get seated in parliament with real legislative power.
But to keep the math from getting entirely out of hand, to prevent a parliament of 100 people representing 100 different fringe parties, the text notes they usually install a threshold, right?
Yes, the threshold is the safety valve. You need a minimum of 5% of the national vote in Germany or 4% in Sweden to get any seats at all. This keeps out the absolute fringe, extremist, or joke elements. But the difference in the daily voter experience between these two systems is profound.
Okay, here is how I try to visualize the difference in voter experience. FPTP is like trying to choose where a group of 20 diverse friends are going to go for dinner, but the rule is you can only pick one restaurant.
You're going to have arguments.
Always. You always end up at the boring middle-of-the-road diner because it's the only place everyone can slightly tolerate without a massive argument breaking out. Nobody is thrilled, but nobody is starving.
And proportional representation.
On the other hand, PR is like taking those 20 friends to a massive, diverse international food court. Everyone splits up, gets exactly the specific, highly flavored niche meal they actually want, sushi, tacos, curry, and then you all sit back down at the same communal table to eat together.
Taking that food court analogy further, it perfectly explains the voter turnout disparity we discussed earlier.
Right.
The text points out that voters in the U.S. often feel like voting for a third party is throwing a vote away, because mathematically it is merely a protest vote. You are forced to choose the diner even if you hate the food.
But European voters in PR systems experience a wider, much more satisfying menu of choices. They can confidently vote for a niche Green Party or a specific Christian Democratic Party and know their vote will directly translate into actual parliamentary seats.
It makes the act of voting feel highly meaningful and targeted, which drives up their participation rates.
But having a massive food court of a dozen parties isn't always peaceful. Which brings us back to Giovanni Sartori and his theory of party competition. He says it's not just the number of parties that matters, it's how they fight each other.
Sartori draws a vital structural distinction between two types of multi-party systems, moderate pluralism and polarized pluralism.
Okay, walk us through moderate pluralism first. What does a healthy ecosystem look like?
In moderate pluralism, you usually have about 5 parties or fewer in the parliament. And crucially, their behavior is center-seeking. The political science term is centripetal.
Centripetal, meaning drawing inward toward the center, like gravity.
Yes, the parties deliberately tone down their extreme ideologies because they mathematically know that the vast bulk of the voting public lives in the moderate middle. To form a coalition government, the left-wing party has to curb its radicalism to ally with the center-left, and the right-wing party has to dampen its conservatism to ally with the center-right. The political life of the nation is calm, stable, and entirely focused on pragmatic compromise.
But polarized pluralism. The text paints this as the absolute dark timeline for democracy.
Polarized pluralism happens when you get too many parties, often more than 5 or 6 significant ones, and the ideological distance between them is vast. Their behavior becomes center-fleeing. The term is centrifugal.
Centrifugal, flying apart outward like a centrifuge spinning out of control.
Exactly. They engage in what Sartori ominously calls a politics of outbidding. Imagine the mechanics of this. The parties on the far left and far right fringes realize they can never win the moderate center. So to ensure their own survival, they try to outbid each other with increasingly radical, extreme, anti-system solutions to rile up their base. They attack the very foundations of the democracy.
Walk us through how that centrifugal outbidding actually destroys the center. Imagine you are a moderate politician in this system.
If you are a moderate politician in a polarized system and you try to act reasonably in compromise with the other side to pass a budget, your own fringe voters immediately accuse you of treason.
Wow.
They call you a sellout. To survive your next primary election, you are forced to adopt a slightly more extreme stance. Now multiply that panic across every single politician in the country. The center completely hollows out. Parties that try to remain moderate are viciously attacked from both the left and the right simultaneously.
And the textbook gives some incredibly grim historical examples of where that outbidding inevitably leads.
It leads to total systemic collapse. The text cites Spain in the 1930s. The parties fled the center, polarized to the absolute extremes of communism and fascism, and the country descended into a horrific, bloody civil war.
I'm Chile.
It also cites Chile in 1973, where severe polarization and outbidding paralyzed the democratic government, ending in a brutal military takeover by Augusto Pinochet. When parties abandon the center and begin delegitimizing the system itself, democracy breaks down.
Which is a heavy, sobering thought, and it brings us to our final overarching question. With all these structural mathematical rules forcing parties together or violently pulling them apart, what do modern political parties actually look like today? Are they thriving organizations or are they slowly dying out?
To understand the modern reality, we have to look at how parties evolved over the last century. The text introduces a classic typology from Maurice Duverger, a highly influential French political scientist. He categorized all historical parties into 3 primary types.
Let's run through Duverger's 3 types.
First, he identified mass parties. These are well-organized, highly ideological organizations funded by a massive base of dues-paying, card-carrying members. Historic West European socialist and labor parties fit this mold perfectly. They were movements as much as they were parties.
And the second type?
Second, you have cadre parties. These are weakly organized top-down structures run by a small, elite cadre of political professionals. They don't really have members in the strict sense, and they only really become hyperactive right before an election. Historically, the U.S. Democrats and Republicans fit the cadre model. So we have the massive bureaucratic mass parties and the elite intermittent cadre parties. But then the text points out a third type that feels much more dangerous parties that are basically just cults of personality. Yes, the devotee parties. These are built entirely around the charisma and the dictates of a single, powerful, often authoritarian personality. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party or Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, the party is just an extension of the leader's will, and they rarely outlive their founder.
But the textbook suggests that in modern prosperous democracies, we've largely moved past these rigid historical categories into a new evolution, something called the catch-all party.
This is based on Otto Kirchheimer's theory of party evolution. He observed that after World War II, as Western Europe grew increasingly prosperous and the middle class expanded, voters began to reject the old, narrow ideological rigidity of the mass parties.
The text uses a great, heavy German word here to describe what voters were rejecting. Weltanschauung, worldview parties. Explain what a worldview party expects of you.
A Weltanschauung party didn't just want your vote on Election Day. They wanted to dictate your entire philosophy on life. They wanted to tell you what newspapers to read, what social clubs to join, what your overarching moral framework should be. They were rigid and demanding.
And as people got wealthier and society got more complex, voters got tired of being told how to live by a party boss.
Exactly. So to survive electorally, the parties had to adapt. They shed their rigid Weltanschauung and became catch-alls. They decided to lower the barriers to entry and welcome everyone.
Give me an example.
The German Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, is the classic textbook example. They stopped being just a Catholic party. They actively sought out business persons, union workers, Catholics, Protestants, farmers, urbanites, everyone. They willingly traded ideological purity for the raw electoral math of a massive coalition.
And today, almost all major ruling parties in modern democracies operate as catch-all parties. The U.S. Republicans and Democrats are arguably the biggest, most sprawling catch-all parties on the planet.
Absolutely.
But there is a massive inherent side effect to being a big tent catch-all party, right? If you let everyone in, doesn't the fighting just move indoors?
It absolutely does. If you invite every competing interest into the tent just to win an election, the major political battles of a nation no longer happen between the competing parties. They happen inside your own party. You are constantly plagued by factional quarrels.
Like the progressive wing fighting the moderate wing of the Democrats.
Or the populist wing fighting the business wing of the Republicans. Much of American politics today is essentially internal neo-institutional warfare within the boundaries of these massive catch-all structures.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of the future. The text asks a fascinating question. Are political parties actually dying?
It's heavily debated.
On one hand, you have incredibly compelling evidence that they are. Official card-carrying party membership is way down globally. Opaque dark money from super PACs completely bypasses the official party apparatus, making the party bosses irrelevant in funding candidates.
And because of sophisticated gerrymandering and demographic sorting, many local voting districts are so uncompetitive that the local party organizations have just withered away. They've become lazy and irrelevant. They don't even have to try to win.
Right. That is a very strong, empirically backed argument for their decline as functional, operational organizations. But the textbook presents a counter-argument that creates a paradox. While the organization is weak ideologically, parties are actually more cohesive than they have been in generations.
Yes. The text notes that in the U.S. Congress, the center has largely been eliminated. Liberal Republicans, who used to exist in New England, and conservative Democrats, who used to dominate the South, are basically extinct.
The voters who identify with the party today are increasingly distinct in their ideology. They share very few core values with the other side.
So we are left with this incredible modern paradox. A modern political party can be incredibly weak as an actual functioning organization, hollowed out by outside money, bypassed by social media, ignored by individualistic candidates, but simultaneously, it can be incredibly strong as an ideological identity for the voter.
The text suggests parties might just become brands, like literally, where voters are choosing between Republicans and Democrats the exact same way they choose between Coke and Pepsi in the grocery aisle. It's an aesthetic choice. Doesn't that imply something deeply cynical? Doesn't that mean we aren't really voting on deep structural policy anymore, but just on lifestyle aesthetics and tribal signaling?
Maintaining our impartial lens here, synthesizing the textbook's final analysis, it means the function of the party is fundamentally shifting. The party may no longer be the robust organization that funds the candidate, trains the volunteers, or writes the granular policy.
But the brand remains.
But the party brand remains the most efficient, powerful shortcut for a voter to navigate a complex political landscape. The activists, the donors, and the candidates are fighting a vicious internal war to control the direction of that brand, much like a corporate boardroom takeover. The brand is the signal cutting through the overwhelming noise of modern media. It's a much weaker organization today, but it remains a remarkably potent, unavoidable symbol.
So let's pull all of this together. Let's unpack the massive journey we've taken in this deep dive. We started with the sheer, unavoidable necessity of parties as an inputting device, the operating system that keeps the lone citizen from standing powerless against the massive machinery of the state.
We saw how they used the uncomfortable friction of interest aggregation to pull competing groups under massive umbrellas, whether that's FDR's 1930s coalition or Reagan's 1980s movement.
We explored the warnings of neo-institutional theory, looking at how organizations can become so obsessed with internal purity that they march stubbornly off an electoral cliff, resulting in historic collapses, like the Canadian Progressive Conservatives going down to just 2 seats.
We examined the control rooms of power, contrasting Israel's ironclad, highly centralized party lists with the decentralized, money-drenched, entrepreneurial chaos of the U.S. system.
We mapped the ideological spectrum across Sweden's Riksdag, and we peered into the shadows of the classic communist monolith, seeing how the dual hat system eventually collapsed under the weight of its own opportunistic apparatchiks.
We counted the players in the global ecosystem, from the heavy dominance of Putin's united Russia to the hyper-competitive, fast-moving multi-party systems.
And we decoded the invisible mathematical rules of the game, how first-past-the-post systems structurally force a two-party diner compromise, while proportional representation opens up a massive food court of options.
We saw how those math rules dictate whether a nation's politicians seek the calm, moderate center or flee toward polarized, system-destroying extremes.
And finally, we arrived at the modern reality of the catch-all party, a massive, sprawling tent that might be hollowing out as a functional organization, but remains a fiercely powerful, defining lifestyle brand for the modern voter.
It is a profound, ongoing evolution of the democratic operating system.
It really is. Now, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've read, but pushes into the future.
Go for it.
We've spent this entire deep dive talking about parties as the essential middleman between the individual citizen and the government. They aggregate our messy interests, they raise the money, they organize the movements. But think about the world we live in right this exact second. Technology allows us to instantly aggregate our own interests online. You can organize a massive global political movement in a single afternoon using just a hashtag.
It's true.
You can crowdsource millions of dollars in campaign funding in a matter of hours directly from citizens without a single national party boss ever approving it.
That is an entirely new paradigm that the historical architects of democracy could never have mathematically anticipated.
So the ultimate question is, do we actually still need the middleman? Are traditional political parties, these massive, lumbering 19th century organizations, about to become obsolete relics of the analog age? Are they going to be slowly replaced by a direct, chaotic, hyper-fast digital democracy? If the operating system is moving entirely to the cloud, do we still need the old hardware? Something to chew on.
A truly fascinating question for the future of political science.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey through the hidden mechanics of power. Stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.
I want you to imagine democracy, right? Not as this philosophy or, a set of lofty ideals on parchment.
Right.
I want you to imagine it as a massive, intricate machine, like this towering, clanking piece of heavy engineering just taking up an entire warehouse.
I like that visual.
Yeah, and the thing is, most of the time, we really only ever look at the output of this machine. We just stand at the very end of the conveyor belt and wait for the finished product to, drop out.
Which is usually just the election itself.
Exactly. It's an election, or it's a new law, or a newly elected official standing at a podium. And we judge the entire machine based entirely on what rolls off that belt.
Right, without seeing how it got made.
Yeah. But today, we are going to look into the hood. We're putting on our hard hats, grabbing a flashlight, and literally walking into the dark to look at the massive gears turning in the background.
We're looking at the invisible engines.
Yes, the invisible engines that actually make the factory run. Because today, we are diving deep into interest groups and political parties.
It is incredibly easy to just, focus entirely on the ballot box.
Oh, totally.
We treat elections like they're the absolute entirety of the political process, when in reality, they are just the final, highly visible stage of a much longer, much more complicated sequence of events.
Right.
The real work, the actual shaping of what ends up on that ballot in the first place, that happens months or years or even decades before Election Day.
Wow. Decades.
Oh, yeah. And it is entirely driven by organized collective action.
Exactly. And, well, that is the core mission of this deep dive today. We've been pouring through this massive stack of source material and research on how elections actually function.
And it is dense stuff.
Super dense. But it covers everything from the psychology of why people organize to the literal mechanics of how a vote is counted. And, the data paints a pretty wild picture.
It really does.
So we're going to decode how these invisible forces actually operate.
Huh.
We're going to look at how groups pool their resources to force specific and sometimes really unpopular issues onto the public agenda.
Right.
And we'll examine how political parties attempt to capture the government from the inside out.
Yeah.
Plus, we'll explore how the physical mechanics of voting vary wildly depending on where you stand on the globe.
Like, incredibly wildly.
Yeah, from the sort of decentralized chaos of the United States to the strict state-funded precision of France to, the incredible bravery required to just cast a vote in places like Afghanistan.
It really is a journey from the theoretical foundations of human behavior, like why we even bother to team up at all the way to the strict, highly regulated campaign laws of Europe.
Yeah.
We are going to connect the micro-level decisions of individual voters, like why you choose to stay home or head to the polls, directly to the macro-level structures that govern entire nations.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because by the end of this deep dive, you won't just know the mechanics of how to fill out a ballot.
Right.
You will understand the invisible forces shaping exactly what you're voting on. You'll see the blueprint of the machine.
Let's start at the very beginning of the assembly line, then.
Perfect. So, before an issue ever reaches a ballot, before a candidate even announces they're running for office, a topic has to be brought to the public's attention.
Someone has to make us care about it.
Exactly. And that requires organization. It requires what we call an interest group.
Right, and we should probably define our terms clearly right out of the gate here so we know exactly what we're dealing with.
Yeah, go for it.
So an interest group is an organized collection of people who seek to influence a political outcome or alter public policy based on a common interest or a shared concern.
Okay.
And the crucial distinction here is that they aren't trying to run the government themselves. They don't want the actual job of president or senator.
They just want to pull the strings.
Basically, yeah. They are trying to influence the people who do hold those jobs. They want to shift the environment to favor their specific cause.
And to truly understand the sheer power of that mechanism, we have to look at how it plays out in real history. In the research we were reviewing, there is this incredible origin story from 1985 that just perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, so imagine 25 women sitting in a room together. They are looking at the political landscape of the mid-'80s, and they realize this fundamental, undeniable truth about modern politics.
Which is that you simply cannot win without serious resources.
Exactly. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't fund a campaign, you effectively don't exist. So they make a pact.
Right.
They decide to pool their money specifically to elect Democratic women to the United States Congress. They didn't form a new political party. They formed an interest group.
And this wasn't just some symbolic gesture or a networking club. They built a highly tactical political interest group and a registered political action committee, or PAC.
And they called it Emily's List.
Right.
Which the acronym is what really gets me. Emily stands for Early Money is Like Yeast.
Because it makes the dough rise.
Yes. It's such a brilliant, pragmatic way to look at the system. It perfectly encapsulates the cold, hard reality of campaign finance.
It really does. If a candidate can show early financial viability, if they can put cash on the board right out of the gate, they suddenly look like a winner.
Exactly. And that early money attracts more support, it buys better polling, it gets the attention of the press, and ultimately, it yields actual votes.
It's a snowball effect, basically. And these 25 women figured out how to start the snowball rolling.
And the results of that calculated pooling of resources were just immediate. They were historical.
Yeah, just 1 year after they formed, in 1986, Barbara Mikulski of Maryland won a seat in the U.S. Senate.
Wow.
And what makes that specific victory so significant is the historical context. She became the first female senator to win a seat not by appointment, meaning she wasn't just filling a vacancy left by a husband or another politician who died or resigned.
Right, she won it outright.
Exactly. She won it in her own right during a regular, highly competitive election cycle, and she ended up serving for 30 years.
That is the direct, tangible output of a relatively small interest group recognizing a flaw in the machine, pooling their resources, and forcing a permanent change in the political landscape.
It's incredible. It shows how a laser-focused goal, backed by early money, can break a massive glass ceiling.
But the thing is, interest groups don't just form to elect people or shift demographics. Sometimes they form out of sheer desperate necessity.
Yes.
Sometimes they form because the government machinery is completely frozen and people are literally dying. Which brings us to the early 1980s and the mobilization around the AIDS epidemic.
This is perhaps one of the most profound examples of group mobilization escalating over time in modern history.
Yeah.
In the early 1980s, when the HIV/AIDS crisis began just tearing through communities, the federal and state governments were largely silent.
Like terrifyingly silent.
Right. There was a shocking lack of public health response, and it was driven by stigma, fear, and cold political calculation. The government simply wasn't acting.
So in that massive vacuum, public interest advocacy groups had no choice but to step in and do the work the state was ignoring.
Right, and our source material mentions early groups like the Gay Men's Health Project.
And what's fascinating about them is that they weren't even lobbying at first. They weren't, walking the halls of Congress in suits handing out pamphlets.
No, not at all.
They were literally just trying to keep their friends and neighbors alive. They were gathering private donations for food. They were securing shelter for patients who had been evicted or abandoned by their families.
They were basically functioning as a shadow public health department.
Exactly. They were providing mutual aid. But, as vital as that is, providing services doesn't cure a disease.
Right, and it certainly doesn't fund massive clinical trials or research.
So as the decade wore on, with still no substantial federal response or funding, the groups realized that mutual aid just wasn't enough anymore.
The tactics had to change. They had to force the government to actually look at them.
Yeah. The groups became more vocal, more organized, and highly confrontational.
Which is where you see a group called the Lavender Hill Mob taking direct action.
Oh man, this story is wild.
They actually stormed a convention held by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They were loud, they were disruptive, and they explicitly demanded immediate research into drugs and treatment.
And then you get ACTUP, which is probably one of the most famous examples of confrontational advocacy in history.
Absolutely.
They famously protested the National Institutes of Health. They understood that polite requests were just being ignored, so they weaponized their anger.
They demanded massive public education campaigns to prevent the disease.
And this escalation, this highly visible, highly disruptive, relentless collective action, it finally worked. It forced the gears of the machine to grind forward.
It did. By 1987, the public pressure generated by these interest groups was so immense that President Ronald Reagan was finally forced to formally acknowledge the crisis.
And he created the Presidential Commission on the HIV epidemic.
Exactly. What this timeline illustrates so clearly is the evolution of an interest group. It harnesses cooperation for a common goal, yes, but it also shows how multiple groups operating on completely different tracks and using entirely different tactics, from quietly providing food banks to aggressively storming federal agencies, can work in concert over years to force a government's hand.
So on one hand, we have Emily's list focusing surgically on campaign finance and elections. And on the other, ACPUP focusing on sheer survival and public health policy.
Right.
The universe of these groups is incredibly vast. So to make sense of it, analysts generally break them down into two main categories: economic groups and non-economic groups.
Let's look at the economic ones first, because these are the heavy hitters.
Oh yeah, these are the groups focused on wages, industry protections, job creation, basically. They care about the bottom line.
Right, and within that massive umbrella of economic groups, you have several subcategories. First, you have business groups.
Like the Chamber of Commerce.
Exactly. The prime example in the U.S. is the United States Chamber of Commerce. It is the world's largest business organization, and its entire mandate is advocating for job creation, corporate tax structures, and broad economic growth that favors business owners.
Okay, so that's broad business. What else?
Then you have agricultural groups, which are incredibly powerful globally.
Yeah, farming is huge politics.
You have the Irish Farmers Association, which advocates ferociously for agricultural workers in Ireland regarding pricing and EU regulations.
Oh, the National Farmers Union in the U.S., right?
Yes. And they lobby for things that directly impact their members' livelihoods, like permanent school lunch funding to ensure a steady, massive market for their produce.
That makes total sense.
Or they push for country of origin labeling so domestic farmers can compete against cheap imports.
And then you have labor groups.
Yeah.
And here's where the scale just kind of blows my mind.
Oh, the numbers are staggering.
In the U.S., we're familiar with the Service Employees International Union, the SEIU, representing healthcare and public service workers. They are a major political force. But if you look at Europe, specifically Germany, the scale is on another level.
Germany has a deeply ingrained history of labor involvement in politics.
Yeah, the German Trade Union Confederation, the DGB, acts as this massive umbrella organization for 8 distinct labor groups. And together, they represent close to 6 million German workers.
It's massive.
Think about that. 6 million people organized under one central political negotiating arm. That is a staggering amount of organized collective influence over the national economy.
It's essentially the population of a small country all pulling in the exact same direction on labor policy.
Right.
It's one of the largest trade organizations in the world, and they have a guaranteed seat at the table when the German government discusses economic policy.
Okay, so contrast that massive, broad-based labor power with professional groups, which are much more niche but equally powerful in their specific domains.
Yeah.
Think of the American Medical Association, the AMA.
Right, they aren't advocating for all workers in the country. They're promoting the very specific interests, liabilities, and billing structures of surgeons and physicians.
Exactly. Or look at the Japan Medical Association. They have about 170,000 members and are widely considered the most politically powerful medical lobby in Japan.
Wow.
They wield immense influence over Japan's national healthcare system. They are economically focused, but strictly for a specific profession.
Okay, so that's the economic side of the house: business, agriculture, labor, professionals. Then we have the non-economic groups.
These are the ones driven by issues, the environment, civil rights, or pure ideology.
We all know the giants like Greenpeace International staging massive environmental protests. But there are also quieter groups, like the Trust for Public Land,
Right.
which is a public interest group whose entire mission is just trying to preserve outdoor spaces and parks for communities. Or you have single-issue groups. And I have to say, I found this particular example from the source material fascinating. The Japan Rice Millers Association.
Oh, yes. Founded in 1969.
They care about one thing and one thing only: the milled rice industry.
That is the textbook definition of a single-issue group. They aren't weighing in on foreign policy or national health care.
Right.
They want government assistance to increase production, streamline distribution, and secure subsidies for that one very specific sector. Their entire political existence is tied to rice.
And then, stepping away from industry entirely, you have civil rights groups. These are foundational to modern democracy.
Absolutely. You have the NAACP in the United States fighting for racial justice and legal equality.
Or you have the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, which works specifically for the rights of off-reserve Indigenous and Métis people in Canada.
Or the Assembly of First Nations, working to advance the rights of First Nations citizens across Canada, negotiating directly with the federal government on land and treaty rights.
And finally, you have ideological groups,
Yeah.
like the Democratic Socialists of America is a prominent one, pushing for a complete shift in how the economy and society are structured. But looking globally, forming these groups isn't always just a matter of filing some paperwork and holding a rally in a park. Our research brought up a truly sobering example: the Civil Human Rights Front in Hong Kong.
Yes. This is a very stark contrast.
They were a massive pro-democracy group peacefully protesting for representation, fair elections, and basic voting rights. But the Beijing government viewed their ideology as an existential threat.
They claim the group was inciting violence.
And the members faced arrests, targeted prosecution, and this intensified systemic crackdown on any form of dissent. The pressure became so overwhelming that the group was forced to disband entirely in August 2021.
It's a chilling reminder that organizing an interest group in some parts of the world carries the ultimate risk. You aren't just risking your time or your money, you are risking your freedom.
Right. It absolutely highlights the fragility of these systems. We often take the right to organize completely for granted.
But the very ability to form an interest group, to gather with like-minded people and demand change, is inherently tied to the democratic freedoms of the state it exists within. If the state does not tolerate pluralism, the group ceases to exist.
Which perfectly sets up the next big philosophical question. We know what these groups are. We know they span from medical lobbies to rice millers to civil rights activists. But why do they form in the first place?
Right. How does a scattered bunch of individuals suddenly decide to become a cohesive, powerful unit?
Exactly. Political scientists have argued over this for decades, and there are three major theories that attempt to explain the psychology of political organization. And I think this is where the real mechanics of human nature start to show.
The first is pluralist theory.
Okay, lay it on me.
Pluralist theory is essentially the most optimistic, sunny view of democracy. It posits that human society is incredibly diverse, and therefore multiple diverse interests will naturally arise and compete for attention and government resources. The core idea is that because power is distributed among so many various competing interests, no single issue or elite class can dominate the public discourse permanently. It's a self-balancing system.
So people just naturally group up.
Basically, individuals look around, realize they are relatively weak on their own, and decide they can advance their own needs far better through collective action. They say, I want a new school built here, you want a new school built here, let's team up and share the cost of the megaphone.
So under pluralism, interest groups form simply as a natural, healthy mechanism for collective action in a free society.
Exact.
Right. Pluralism sounds like a lively, crowded town hall meeting. Everyone is in the room, everyone is shouting to be heard, and it's messy and chaotic. But ultimately, it's fair because everyone has a right to grab a microphone.
The loudest, most popular ideas win out.
But then we have the second theory, which takes a totally different angle. Disturbance theory, developed by political scientist David Truman.
Disturbance theory argues that groups don't just form naturally out of the ether because people like to organize. Truman argued they form in direct reaction to a shock to the system.
A disturbance.
Right. External factors like a massive change in social norms, a disruptive new technology, a sudden economic depression, or an environmental crisis create a disturbance in the status quo.
Okay.
That disturbance threatens a certain group of people or presents a new opportunity, and that specific pressure forces them to organize.
The historical examples of this are everywhere. Think about marijuana legalization.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. 50 years ago, legalizing marijuana was a fringe counterculture idea, completely outside the political mainstream. But as social norms shifted and as medical research evolved, that societal shift is on, the disturbance groups began to form to capitalize on it.
You get organizations like NORML, the Marijuana Policy Project, and the Drug Policy Alliance forming to push for controlled, legal, taxable markets.
Or look at global climate change. As the weather patterns worsen and the headlines get more dire, you see newer, more radical groups forming in direct response to that existential environmental disturbance.
Groups like Extinction Rebellion in Britain engaging in massive acts of peaceful civil disobedience.
The environmental crisis is the disturbance, and the group is the symptom.
Precisely. The environment changes, the equilibrium is broken, and the political ecosystem adapts by forming new groups to address the new reality.
But then we reach the third theory, transaction theory. And this one, developed by Robert H. Salisbury, is far more cynical.
Much more cynical, Salisbury essentially looks at the pluralist idea of the lively town hall and says, that's a complete myth.
Yeah. Oh.
He argues that political actors, the politicians actually making the laws, are not actually influenced by the messy masses of mobilized citizen groups. Instead, they are responding to a very narrow, highly resourced set of elites.
So it's not a debate.
No, the relationship between the government and interest groups isn't a democratic debate, it's an exchange. It's a transaction between the wealthy who need policies protected and the politicians who need funding to stay in power.
So if pluralism is the lively democratic town hall, transaction theory sounds more like a VIP room at a very exclusive club.
I love that analogy.
A few elites and corporate lobbyists are quietly sitting in the back room, sipping scotch, and making the real deals, while everyone else is stuck outside on the street thinking their shouting and sign-waving actually matters.
It's a painfully accurate analogy, and it leads perfectly into the work of economist Mancora Olson, who provides the underlying mathematical and psychological logic for why that VIP room exists in the first place.
Okay, lay some economics on me.
Olson focused on something called the free rider problem, which revolves around the concept of collective goods.
Collective goods.
Yes, a collective good is something that, once achieved, everyone gets to enjoy, regardless of whether they lifted a finger to help secure it. The classic example is clean air.
Right. Let's say a grassroots environmental group spends 10 years lobbying, raising money, and protesting to pass a law that forces a local factory to stop polluting the air.
Right.
If they win, I get to breathe that clean air, even if I never donated a single dime, never went to a protest, and completely ignored the entire campaign.
Exactly. In economic terms, you are the free rider. You get the benefit with absolutely zero cost.
Sweet deal for me.
It is. And Olson argues that because human beings are generally rational and self-interested, most regular individuals will look at that equation and decide not to exert the extra energy, time, or money to mobilize into an interest group.
Right. Why would you sacrifice your weekends and your paycheck if you get the benefit of the collective good anyway?
Exactly. Therefore, Olson concludes that the groups that do manage to form, overcome the free rider problem, and sustain themselves long-term tend to be backed by narrow elite interests who have a direct, outsized financial stake in the outcome.
I see.
A massive corporation isn't a free rider when $1 billion tax loophole is on the line. They have a massive incentive to hire lobbyists. It explains why the VIP room has so much power. They are the only ones with the focused mathematical incentive to actually pay the exorbitant cover charge.
Okay, that is a perfect bridge into the next massive gear in this machine. Because now that we know why groups form and we understand the inherent advantage the wealthy have in forming them, we have to look at how they actually execute that power.
How they turn money and organization into actual laws.
Exactly. And this brings us right to the mechanics of lobbying, bias, and the money trail.
And it's important to recognize that none of this is a modern accident. The founders of the United States actually anticipated this exact tension.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. James Madison, writing in Federalist Paper number 10 back in 1787, directly addressed the threat of what he called factions, which is just an older term for interest groups.
Okay.
He was worried that a powerful faction could hijack the government. But his proposed solution was essentially the pluralist theory.
The town hall idea.
Right. He believed that if you build a healthy, expansive representative government over a large geographic area, it would ensure that so many different interests would form that no single faction could ever monopolize the government's attention.
So they basically just cancel each other out.
Exactly. The sheer volume and competition among all these interests would cancel out the extremes and ultimately protect the democracy.
It's the Madisonian ideal. More voices, more competition, better governance. It sounds great on paper.
It does.
But as we just discussed with transaction theory, there's a massive flaw in that ideal. Factionalism doesn't always cancel itself out evenly. Sometimes, a small group with a shared interest and a massive bank account manages to hijack the government's attention despite the needs or the votes of the majority.
And that leads directly to what political scientists call economic bias.
Let's get into this because this is where it gets really real.
This is where we have to introduce E. Schachtschneider. He was a renowned political scientist who delivered one of the most famous and devastating critiques of pluralism.
What did he say?
He looked at Madison's idea of a beautiful chorus of competing voices and said, "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent."
Oof, let's really dissect that. The heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent. It's such a poetic way to describe a very harsh reality.
It really is. What Schachtschneider meant is that while, theoretically, in a free society, anyone can form an interest group, in reality, groups representing corporate business or elite professional interests have vastly more resources to actually make their voices heard.
Right.
They have the money to hire full-time staff, they have the time to track complex legislation, and they have the institutional knowledge to navigate the Byzantine rules of the system.
Because it's confusing on purpose sometimes.
Exactly. Even if lower class or working class interests are technically represented by a group, the people who actually have the leisure time, the education, and the resources to join and run those groups tend to be from the upper middle and upper classes.
So it creates a self-fulfilling feedback loop.
Yes. The well-resourced groups get the attention of the politicians, which in turn attracts more well-resourced people to join those groups to protect their assets.
And this leads to a phenomenon researchers call interest group liberalism. It's the somewhat depressing idea that government officials don't respond to well-organized groups because those groups necessarily have the best ideas for society or the most moral arguments.
Right.
They respond simply because those groups are the absolute best at demanding action. They have the loudest, most persistent, most expensive megaphones. They never stop talking, so the government eventually listens.
And we can see this disparity, this economic bias play out in stark relief in real-world issues right now.
Give me an example from the research.
Consider the advocacy group One Fair Wage. They're fighting a grueling battle against a practice in the U.S. restaurant industry where waitstaff and bartenders can be paid a sub-minimum wage of just $2.13 an hour.
Which is just wild to think about.
The legal justification for this is the assumption that customer tips will make up the difference to ensure the worker reaches the standard minimum wage.
Which, if you've ever worked in the service industry, you know is incredibly unstable.
Highly unstable.
Some diners simply don't tip, regardless of the service. Tips are often pooled and split differently for front-of-house staff versus the line cooks in the back. And statistically, this system disproportionately hurts women and minority workers who make up the bulk of what is simultaneously the fastest-growing but lowest-paying sector of the American economy.
Exactly. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, this vulnerability wasn't just a talking point. It was utterly exposed.
Restaurants closed, foot traffic vanished, and the income for these workers was practically obliterated overnight.
So one fair wage is fighting for strict health, safety, and guaranteed baseline wage measures. But look at who they're fighting against.
Right.
They're going up against massive, highly resourced, deeply entrenched restaurant and hospitality lobbies representing multi-billion-dollar corporate chains. Those chains want to keep labor costs as low as legally possible.
That is Schachtschneider's economic bias in action. The working class is trying to shout, but the corporate lobby has the upper class accent.
Exactly. So how do these well-resourced groups actually exert that influence day to day? The formal professional work is called lobbying, which is broadly defined as attempting to influence a political outcome.
And we can divide this profession into two main tactics, right? Inside lobbying and outside lobbying.
Correct. Inside lobbying is the traditional image we all have, cultivating direct contacts, building relationships, and walking the halls of government.
To understand how this works on a human level, there's an illuminating interview in our sources with a professional named Andy Chasen.
Oh, yes.
He's the vice president of federal policy and advocacy for Blue Shield of California, which is a massive health insurance provider. He explains that his daily job is to provide strategic advice on what's happening in Washington, D.C., and he literally lobbies both houses of Congress and administrative agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services.
Right.
And he mentioned something crucial about how the game is played. His company has a PAC. Employees voluntarily contribute to this PAC, and that pooled money is used to buy tickets to attend fundraising events with lawmakers.
And he's very clear about what that money does and doesn't buy.
Yeah. He explicitly says that handing over a check doesn't guarantee a lawmaker will actually vote the way you want. That would be overt bribery.
Right. Which is illegal.
But what the money does do is provide the opportunity to be in the room. It buys access to share your perspective while the lawmaker is listening.
Access is the absolute currency of inside lobbying. You can't make your argument if you can't get the meeting.
Wow.
Groups use this access to testify before congressional committees. They offer their legal teams to help overworked congressional staffers craft the actual text of complex legislation.
Wait, lobbyists literally write the laws sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Or they provide massive dossiers of policy research to influence the executive branch's regulatory decisions. But inside lobbying also targets the judicial branch, which requires a completely different strategy because courts don't pass legislation, they interpret it.
Right. You can't just take a Supreme Court justice to a fundraising dinner. So how do they lobby the courts?
Well, they try to influence judicial appointments during the Senate confirmation process, ensuring judges sympathetic to their worldview get on the bench in the first place.
Okay.
But more directly, they use what are called amicus curiae briefs, which translates to friend of the court briefs.
I've heard that term.
This is a formal legal mechanism that allows an interest group, who is not a direct party to a lawsuit, to officially file a massive legal argument stating their position on a case, hoping to sway the judge's legal reasoning.
And if filing a brief isn't enough, these groups can just outright fund massive landscape-altering lawsuits.
Yes, they can.
The classic example in the text is Sierra Club v. Trump. The ACLU, acting as the legal muscle on behalf of the Sierra Club and the Southern Border Communities Coalition, directly sued President Trump over his use of emergency executive power to divert military funds to build a border wall.
Right.
Think about what that is. It's three distinct interest groups combining their legal and financial forces to challenge the head of the executive branch in federal court.
It's massive power.
That case went all the way to the Supreme Court before it was eventually dismissed when President Biden took office and rescinded the order. That is the pinnacle of high-level, well-funded inside lobbying. But what happens when your group doesn't have a floor full of high-priced lawyers or the cash to buy access to the VIP room?
That's when you go outside.
Right.
Outside lobbying, which is also known as grassroots lobbying, is about rallying massive public support to pressure political actors from the outside in.
If you can't buy the politicians' time, you make them fear for their job by mobilizing their constituents.
Exactly. You call upon your members and the general public to make a massive show of force through letter-writing campaigns, phone banks, or protests.
The successful movement to recall California Governor Gavin Newsom forcing a special election is a prime example of grassroots outside lobbying mobilizing enough angry voters to trigger a massive ballot initiative.
And outside lobbying can get far more extreme than just signing a petition. When groups feel entirely locked out of the system, they turn to disruption.
Like the Kings Bay Plowshare 7.
Yes. A group of Catholic pacifist activists who illegally entered a highly secure naval submarine facility in Georgia to protest the U.S. nuclear arsenal.
They were willing to face federal prison time to force a public conversation.
Or look at Extinction Rebellion, where members literally glue their hands to airplanes or block major highways to force the media to point their cameras at the climate crisis.
When you don't have the money for the VIP room, your only option to be heard is to stand outside and block the streets so the VIPs can't leave.
It's also worth noting how the fundamental structure of a nation's government changes which lobbying tactics are effective. Take Switzerland, for example.
Yep.
The Swiss system relies heavily on direct democracy through ballot initiatives, where the voters themselves decide directly on major legislation, bypassing the parliament.
Wow, just directly voting on the laws.
Yeah. Because interest groups in Switzerland can appeal directly to the public to get laws passed, they are far less reliant on the secretive inside lobbying we see in the U.S.
That makes sense.
Interestingly, studies show that because of this system, Swiss lobbying tends to be highly negative. Groups act as gatekeepers, spending their resources to convince the public to block and vote down laws they don't like, rather than proactively proposing new ones.
Okay, we've talked about the tactics, but we need to talk about the fuel for all of this, the actual money.
The lifeblood of the machine.
We mentioned PAC's political action committees earlier with Emily's list.
Mm-hmm.
A PAC is a group's official, legally registered fundraising arm. Now, traditional PACs have strict legal limits. A PAC can accept a maximum of $5,000 from an individual donor per year, and they can give that same maximum of $5,000 to a single candidate per election, or up to $15,000 to a national party. It's heavily regulated. But the sheer variety of who has a PAC is astonishing.
Let's talk about Taco Pack.
Yes, the official political action committee for the Taco Bell franchise system.
I want the listener to really think about this for a second. When you hit the drive-thru and buy a Crunchwrap Supreme, you are interacting with a corporate ecosystem that is deeply entrenched in federal politics.
It's true.
Between the 2018 and 2020 election cycles, Taco Pack raised and donated over $100,000 to Republican candidates and about $2,500 to Democrats.
Right.
They don't do this because they have a stance on foreign policy. They do this to ruthlessly protect the specific economic interests of the quick-serve franchise restaurant industry, fighting against minimum wage hikes, fighting against mandatory paid leave, pushing for favorable corporate tax rates.
And it's not just the Bell. No. Wendy's contributed over $100,000 in that same period. McDonald's gave $500,000. The fast food industry is a massive political player.
It perfectly illustrates how corporate interests, even ones we interact with in the most mundane ways, pool their massive resources to protect their specific economic environment.
Yeah.
But here is the critical point. Regular PACs, like Taco Packs, are heavily regulated, they have hard contribution limits, and they are legally required to publicly disclose the names of their donors.
You can look up exactly who gave them money.
Yes. The real earthquake in American campaign finance, the thing that fundamentally altered the machine, came with the invention of super PACs.
Right. Here we go. Super PACs, technically known as independent expenditure-only committees. Unlike regular PACs, super PACs can raise and spend absolutely unlimited amounts of money.
Unlimited.
A billionaire can write a single check for $50 million to a super PAC. The only legal catch is that the super PAC cannot explicitly coordinate its strategy or ad buys with the candidate's official campaign. They have to operate independently.
Air quotes around independently.
Heavy air quotes.
Oh.
And this entire concept was born out of the highly controversial 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission.
A landmark case.
The court essentially ruled that corporations and labor unions have First Amendment rights, and therefore, limiting their independent political spending is an unconstitutional restriction on free speech. Money, in the eyes of the court, equals speech.
And critics of that ruling point out that by equating unlimited money with free speech, it empowered the wealthiest donors and corporations beyond measure, completely drowning out the voices of average citizens.
Right.
Furthermore, it gave rise to the phenomenon of dark money.
Okay, break down dark money.
Dark money occurs because super PACs can receive massive unlimited donations from 501c4, nonprofits, and shell corporations.
What's a shell corporation?
A shell corporation is a company that exists entirely on paper. It has no physical office, no employees, no products, just a legal name and a bank account. Wealthy individuals or corporations funnel millions into the shell company, and then the shell company donates to the super PAC. Because of the legal structure, the ultimate source of the money, the true identity of the donor, remains completely hidden from the public.
It's untraceable influence.
Yeah,
And the growth of this spending has been nothing short of explosive.
it really has.
In the 2020 election cycle, total Super PAC spending soared to over $2 billion. Just let that number sink in. $2 billion spent by technically independent groups, much of it completely untraceable, flooding the airwaves with attack ads and propaganda.
It's staggering.
When you have billions of dollars moving through shadow networks, it fundamentally distorts the democratic process.
The sheer staggering volume of that money naturally leads to intense public demands for regulation. The government has to figure out how to monitor the massive army of lobbyists.
How many are there?
Well, there are roughly 11,000 officially registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. However, as experts like American University professor James Thurber calculate, when you account for consultants, public relations experts, and strategic advisors who do the exact same work but avoid the legal definition of lobbyist,
Right.
the true number of people acting in this capacity is closer to 100,000.
100,000 people. That's an entire city's worth of professionals whose sole job is to pressure the government. How do you even begin to regulate an army that large?
It's an ongoing battle. We've seen legislative efforts like the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007.
What did that do?
It attempted to place tighter restrictions on campaign contributions, banned lobbyists from buying gifts and lavish travel for lawmakers, and importantly, created revolving door bans.
Revolving door.
Right. The revolving door is the practice where a lawmaker retires and immediately takes a highly paid job at a lobbying firm, cashing in on their contacts. The 2007 Act mandated that elected officials have to wait at least 1 to 2 years after leaving government before they can officially lobby their former colleagues.
And we saw this push for regulation continue recently. President Biden expanded on these ethics rules in 2021 with an executive order.
Yeah.
He pushed for a strict 2-year revolving door ban for senior executive branch officials.
Right.
But the part I found truly fascinating was his specific ban on golden parachutes.
Oh, this is a big one.
A golden parachute, in this context, is a massive, multi-million-dollar exit bonus that a private corporation gives to one of its executives right as they leave the company to take a high-level job in the federal government.
Right. Think about the perverse incentive there.
It's basically a private corporation paying someone a fortune as they walk out the door to take a government job where they will likely be regulating that very same corporation.
Exactly. Biden's order explicitly aimed to stop that practice, to prevent overt corporate capture of regulatory agencies.
And we must recognize that regulating influence isn't just an American struggle, it's a global challenge.
Oh, absolutely.
The European Union developed the European Transparency Initiative, or ETI, attempting to boost public confidence in EU decision-making. They created a registry for lobbyists in Brussels.
But scholars and watchdogs frequently point out that these regulations are largely unenforced and require very minimal, vague information from the lobbyists.
So it's mostly for show.
It's more of a suggestion than a rule. And in several countries like Germany, Georgia, Lithuania, and Poland, lobbyist registration is completely voluntary.
Wow.
Which means, practically speaking, it lacks any real teeth as an enforcement measure. Bad actors simply choose not to register.
All right, so we've exhaustively mapped out the world of interest groups. They organize around a cause, they amass incredible amounts of money, and they use inside access and outside pressure to influence anyone who happens to be in power, regardless of the party. But that brings us to the next major component of the machine, the party apparatus. Because political parties are a different beast entirely. They don't just want to lobby the government, they want to be the government.
That is the crucial defining distinction. An interest group will happily work with any elected official from any party who is willing to help their specific cause.
Yeah.
A political party, however, has a much broader mandate. Their primary goal is to organize a massive coalition of voters around a shared, comprehensive ideology and ultimately elect their own members to positions of control from within the government.
They want the keys to the car.
They do. They operate cooperatively over the long term to secure legislative control, passing broad agendas that they couldn't possibly achieve as fractured individuals. In fact, some political scholars argue that strong political parties are essential because they act as the only real counterweight to powerful interest groups, curbing their external influence by enforcing party discipline.
And one of the most vital mechanical jobs of a political party is simply finding the people to run for office.
Candidate recruitment. You know, standard bearers.
Right. Look at Nancy Pelosi. She is not just the first woman to hold the immensely powerful position of Speaker of the House. She is the only woman to hold it twice. She's a masterclass in party mechanics and coalition building.
Absolutely.
And the party machinery has been actively working to change the face of its recruits. The year 2020 saw a massive sea change in American politics. Almost half of all the candidates seeking congressional seats were women, 204 out of 435 races.
It was a record year.
Because of that recruitment push, women now make up just over a quarter of the 117th Congress. That is a historical record and a 50% increase from just a decade ago. Parties are the institutional pipelines that vet, train, and fund those candidates.
The old political adage holds true. You can't win if you don't run. And a political party that cannot recruit and nominate viable, charismatic candidates is essentially a toothless organization.
Yeah.
But beyond finding the candidates, parties in the U.S. shoulder an incredibly heavy, unglamorous logistical burden: voter registration.
This is a massive point of friction in the United States compared to almost every other developed country.
Huge friction.
In many places, citizens are automatically registered to vote by the government when they come of age. But Americans are not automatically registered. Some states have motor voter laws that register you when you get a driver's license, but otherwise the burden falls largely on the political parties.
Right. They have to spend millions of dollars going out into communities, knocking on doors, and physically finding and registering voters to build their base.
And because the parties have to actively manage this, you see wild fluctuations in registration numbers based entirely on current events.
We can see this dynamic clearly in recent election cycles. In the intense run-up to the 2020 election, the Republican Party focused massive resources heavily on grassroots registration in key battleground states.
Right.
They successfully added close to 150,000 new voters to the rolls in Florida and 30,000 in Arizona, attempting to build a firewall.
The sword cuts both ways. Following the violence at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, the New York Times analyzed voter data and reported that roughly 140,000 registered members actively left the Republican Party across the 25 states that formally track that data.
That's a significant drop.
Conversely, the tragic death of George Floyd in the summer of 2020 spurred a massive wave of civic engagement and new Democratic voter registrations in key swing states like Michigan and Minnesota.
Major cultural and political events act as catalysts, driving engagement up or down. And the parties have to constantly react, spending fortunes to capitalize on the momentum to build or repair their voter base.
To truly understand how parties operate, we need to pan out and look at the structure of party systems globally, because the United States is somewhat of an anomaly.
It is. The U.S. has steadily maintained a rigid two-party system for over a century and a half. Two dominant, massive parties. The Democrats and the Republicans have a realistic chance of winning national control.
Right. Third parties absolutely exist. The Green Party, the Libertarians, the Democratic Socialists, but they rarely hold any significant national power. They usually act as spoilers or issue advocates.
But compare that rigid two-party structure to a place like the United Kingdom.
Okay, let's look at the UK.
Historically, they also had a long period of two-party dominance with the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But in recent decades, it has fractured and shifted toward a true multi-party system.
The Liberal Democrats gained significant ground as a moderating force.
Right. And the single-issue Brexit Party, which is now Reform UK, completely altered the national landscape by pulling the Conservatives to the right.
Or look at Germany. The German political landscape has evolved dramatically.
Oh, Germany is a fascinating case study.
Before World War II, the Weimar Republic had dozens of fractured parties. Under the Nazis, it was brutally consolidated into a single-party totalitarian state. After the war, West Germany developed a stable, multi-party democracy, and it has only grown more complex. In 2016, the election results were so fractured that it resulted in a stunning six-party government.
6 parties sharing power.
The ruling coalition had to share power and negotiate cabinet positions among the Social Democrats, the far-right Alternative for Germany, the Christian Democrats, the Left Party, the Greens, and the pro-business Free Democrats.
Operating a government with a 6-party coalition requires an entirely different style of political leadership. It cannot be winner-take-all. It must be based on constant, grueling compromise and power sharing.
If one party gets mad and leaves the coalition, the government collapses.
Exactly. Now, at the completely opposite extreme of the spectrum, you have single-party systems. In these states, the machine only has one gear.
Right. China has technically allowed 8 minor subordinate parties to exist, but it is effectively a rigid single-party state where the Chinese Communist Party has maintained absolute control over all levers of government and society since 1949.
Cuba has been a single-party communist state since the 1959 revolution. The African nation of Eritrea has been ruled by a single party and the exact same single leader since it gained independence in 1993, never holding a national election.
And then you have a fascinating outlier, Japan.
Yes.
Japan is a fully competitive, advanced democracy with free and fair elections. But they have what political scientists call a dominant party system.
Right, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
They have managed to maintain an almost unbroken grip on power for decades. They win competitive elections time and time again by maintaining a massive, deeply entrenched coalition of rural farmers, big business, and bureaucratic elites.
But regardless of whether a country has 2 parties, 6 parties, or 1 dominant party, political scientists are tracking a fascinating global trend, the decline of traditional political parties.
The era of the all-powerful party boss in a smoke-filled back room like the infamous 19th century boss Tweed who controlled every political appointment in New York is fading away.
The party machinery is losing its grip. We are instead seeing the rapid rise of the candidate-centered campaign.
Scholars argue that traditional parties are slowly losing their historic ability to blindly mobilize voters' opinions.
Right. Voters are becoming more independent, more polarized, and politically adrift from party loyalty. And stepping into this massive vacuum are highly entrepreneurial, often charismatic candidates.
In the modern era, these candidates don't necessarily need the traditional party machinery to launch a campaign because they possess independent wealth to self-fund, or they have a direct, unfiltered line to the public through mass media and social media.
The ultimate historical example of this disruption in the U.S. is Ross Perot in 1992.
Oh man, Ross Perot.
He was a self-made billionaire who just decided to fund his own run for president as an independent third-party candidate. He bought massive blocks of television time to show his economic charts.
Right, the infomercials.
Yeah, he didn't win, but he bypassed the parties entirely and took an astonishing 20% of the popular vote, fundamentally altering the race between Bush and Clinton.
Or look at Donald Trump in 2016. He ran a hostile takeover campaign largely outside the traditional Republican Party establishment platform.
Right. He didn't rely on the party bosses. He used his own massive media-savvy and unscripted rallies to bypass the traditional gatekeepers and speak directly to the base.
When candidates no longer rely on the party for their money or their media access, the party permanently loses its leverage over them.
And this decline in party power is a global phenomenon. Across Europe, traditional party membership roles and grassroots activism have seen steady, long-term, absolute declines.
Wow.
Scholars attribute this to parties becoming too professionalized, too enmeshed with the state apparatus, and ignoring their working-class roots. But beneath all of this, there's a profound, tectonic demographic shift happening in the electorate, famously documented by the French economist Thomas Piketty.
Piketty's data on this is absolutely wild. If you look historically at post-war democracies, specifically the U.S., France, and Britain in the 1950s and 60s, the dividing lines were really clear.
Very clear.
Working-class voters, labor union members, those with lower incomes and less formal education, reliably supported left-of-center progressive parties. Meanwhile, highly educated professionals and high-income corporate executives reliably supported conservative, pro-business parties.
It was a clear class divide.
But Piketty shows that over the last few decades, that alignment has completely flipped on its head.
It is a massive generational realignment. Today, across Western democracies, those with the highest levels of formal university education and high income levels are increasingly trending toward liberal, left-wing, globalist candidates.
Right.
Meanwhile, the traditional working class and less educated voters in rural or deindustrialized areas are shifting en masse to support conservative, nationalist policies.
This total breakdown of traditional 20th century class-based party loyalty creates immense instability. The old coalitions are dead, and the parties are scrambling to figure out who their voters actually are.
And what rushes in to fill a massive void of political instability? Populism.
Right, populism.
Populism is the political approach that appeals directly to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are being completely disregarded by an established, corrupt elite group. When traditional parties fail to deliver, populist leaders thrive by promising to smash the system.
Look at Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He rose to absolute power after the traditional establishment parties completely collapsed under the weight of massive corruption scandals in the 1990s.
Chavez stepped into the void, shifting the entire country to a confrontational populist leftism that dismantled the old institutions.
Or look at Indonesia, where a heavy reliance on political patronage, the corrupt practice of giving government jobs and contracts exclusively to family members and loyal supporters weakened the traditional party coalitions.
Right.
This institutional rot opened the door wide for populist leaders like President Joko Widodo, who campaigned as an outsider promising to clean house. When the machine of the political party breaks down, populism is the fire that takes its place.
Which brings us to the crucible, where all these forces, the lobbying, the billions of dollars, the shifting party loyalties finally collide. The ultimate decision-making mechanism, the election.
Right. Let's go back to James Madison for a second. In Federalist Paper 52, Madison argued that frequent scheduled elections are the only possible way to ensure that representatives maintain a genuine sympathy for and a strict dependence on the people they govern.
It's the ultimate accountability mechanism.
An impending election forces a politician to be transparent about their plans, because if they stray too far from the public will, they get fired. But applying modern economic theory to this process reveals two massive systemic flaws in how we actually vote.
The first flaw is something called adverse selection.
Okay, let's unpack adverse selection.
In classical economics, adverse selection occurs when one party in a transaction has significantly more information than the other. Usually, the seller has more info than the buyer. A great analogy is going to an animal shelter to adopt a puppy.
Okay, a puppy.
You see a cute dog, but you have no idea about its genetic lineage, its hidden health defects, or how it was treated before it arrived. The seller knows much more of the truth. You, the buyer, are operating at a severe information deficit, which means you might make a choice you'll regret.
Okay, so map that puppy analogy onto a multi-billion-dollar political election.
In an election, the voters are the buyers. We are buying a platform and a candidate. The political campaigns, the massive super PACs, and the interest groups are the sellers.
Right.
The reality of modern life is that voters rarely have the time, the energy, or the specialized resources to fully educate themselves on the intricate, microscopic details of every candidate's history or the long-term economic impacts of a complex policy.
So the side that can control the flow of information, which is almost always the side with the most money to buy television ads and digital targeting, has a massive structural advantage.
They curate the reality the voter sees.
And the ultimate example of this information control was California's Proposition 22 in 2020.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
This was a highly complex ballot initiative, asking voters to decide if gig economy drivers for massive companies like Uber and Lyft should legally be classified as full employees entitled to minimum wage, overtime, and health care, or if they should remain independent contractors.
Right.
The gig companies, whose entire business model relied on cheap, independent labor, spent a record-breaking $205 million on a relentless, omnipresent ad campaign to convince voters to exempt them from the employee rules.
$205 million.
Wait, hang on. I have to look at this from the voter's perspective. If I go to an electronics store and buy a bad television because I fell for a flashy commercial, that's adverse selection. Shame on me. I should have read the reviews.
Right.
But if massive gig companies are deploying a $205 million ad budget, flooding every YouTube video, every billboard, every podcast I listen to, with highly curated, emotionally manipulative messaging about a complex labor law, how is a regular person working a 9-to-5 job ever supposed to fight through that?
It's incredibly difficult.
Isn't the system just fundamentally rigged at that point? It's not just a lack of information. It's a tidal wave of engineered misinformation.
It is a highly valid, critical point. How can a democracy function when the marketplace of ideas is bought out by the highest bidder? It highlights exactly why elections in the U.S., which cost an astronomical $14 billion across all races in the last presidential cycle, are uniquely susceptible to adverse selection.
$14 billion.
When billions are spent to obscure the truth, the voter is flying blind. And this directly leads to the second economic flaw. Moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
This is the inherent risk a voter takes that a candidate, once successfully elected and safely in office, will simply abandon their campaign promises and not act the way the voter hoped.
Right, because campaigning and governing are two completely different skill sets.
Exactly. Elections frequently promote the charismatic and unqualified who happen to be amazing at raising money rather than the boring administrators who are actually good at governing.
Voting ultimately requires a massive leap of faith, and that risk frequently leads to deep disappointment.
And that constant disappointment, election after election, naturally breeds deep public apathy, Which brings us to the depressing mechanical reality of voter turnout.
Let's start with a definition. VEP stands for Voting Eligible Population. This is every single human in the country who is old enough to vote, minus those legally barred from the process, like non-citizens or, in some states, convicted felons.
Registered voters, on the other hand, are the much smaller subset of the VEP who have actually jumped through the bureaucratic hoops to get their names on the voter rolls.
And when you look at the turnout numbers in the United States compared to the rest of the developed world, the data is stark.
It's pretty bleak.
Over the last 20 years, U.S. voter turnout in presidential elections has generally hovered somewhere between 52% and 66% of the eligible population. In midterms, it's often much lower.
To put that in perspective, that dismal turnout rate ranks America roughly 30th out of 35 OECD countries, the Organization of Developed Democratic Nations.
30th out of 35. That is definitely not a gold medal for the world's most famous democracy.
No, it's not.
And when you dig into the data of who actually endures the friction to cast a ballot, a clear demographic picture emerges. The data consistently shows that wealthy, older, highly educated white populations have the highest and most reliable turnout rates.
Conversely, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, young voters under the age of 24, and citizens without a high school degree have the lowest turnout.
And we have to be honest with the history of the machine here. The demographic disparity isn't just an accident of apathy. We have to talk about voter suppression.
It is an undeniable fact that the U.S. has a long, extensively documented history of deliberate voter suppression.
Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era in the South saw the implementation of targeted mechanisms like impossible literacy tests, poll taxes, and sheer physical terror, all explicitly designed by the ruling class to bar minority citizens, particularly Black Americans, from exercising their constitutional right to vote.
While those specific laws were struck down by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the debate over voter access remains incredibly fierce today, centering around new waves of state-level legislation.
Exactly. For example, the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institute, reported that in just the early months of 2021, 14 different states enacted 22 new laws that objectively restricted access to the polls.
We're talking about much stricter voter ID requirements, dramatically shortened windows to request or return mail-in ballots, and reductions in ballot drop boxes.
The debate around these laws is intense. Proponents argue they are necessary security measures to prevent voter fraud and maintain the integrity of the election.
Opponents, however, argue these laws are intentionally and surgically designed to target minority and working-class voters. Voters who statistically may not have the flexible work schedules, transportation, or resources to quickly meet onerous ID requirements or shortened voting windows, resulting in suppressed turnout.
But we should also recognize that deliberate suppression by those in power isn't uniquely American. Look at the European Union.
Yes, the EU expat situation.
There are roughly 17 million EU citizens who live and work outside their home country. But illiberal nationalist governments in places like Hungary and Poland have taken active legislative steps to intentionally discourage the political participation of these expats.
Why? Because the ruling parties fear that citizens who have moved abroad to more progressive countries will mail in ballots that vote against the conservative home government.
So they make the logistics of voting from abroad as difficult as possible to suppress that diaspora vote.
Beyond deliberate, targeted suppression, there are also deep systemic barriers built into the machine itself. Oren Lidgfart, a highly respected political scientist, identified several institutional, mechanical reasons for low U.S. turnout.
One is simply voter fatigue.
The United States holds a staggering number of elections.
We elect a president every 4 years, the entire House of Representatives every 2 years, plus countless state legislators, mayors, city councils, school boards, judges, and special ballot initiatives.
Voters are just exhausted by the constant, relentless demand for their attention.
It's overwhelming.
You can contrast that fatigue with Switzerland, which we mentioned earlier. Switzerland actually has one of the lowest turnouts in Europe, around 40%, even in cantons, where voting is legally compulsory.
The reason is precisely because they hold so many frequent referendums and ballot initiatives. The citizens simply tune out.
Another massive, glaring barrier in the U.S. system is the complete lack of a national election day holiday.
Most working-class Americans have to work a full shift or go to school on a random Tuesday in November. Finding the time to stand in line for 2 hours is a luxury.
Japan, for instance, entirely avoids this problem by simply holding their national elections on Sundays when the majority of the country is already off work.
And then there is the friction of the registration rules themselves. In much of Europe and South America, the government takes on the burden. Registration is automatic when you hit a certain age.
In the US, the onus is entirely on the individual citizen to figure it out.
Now, 21 progressive states have implemented same-day registration, allowing you to show up, register, and vote all at once. But other states enforce rigid deadlines, require you to register up to 30 days before the election even happens.
If you get interested in a political race in the final weeks, but miss the arbitrary deadline, you are locked out. That administrative friction fundamentally prevents participation.
And underpinning all of this mechanical friction, all the rules and regulations, is a much deeper sociological collapse. Researchers point to a massive generational decline in what they call social capital.
Social capital refers to the invisible web of relationships, the trust, and the civic networks like bowling leagues, church groups, and neighborhood associations that help a community organize and solve problems together.
Studies show a direct correlation. High social capital equals a high trust in government, which results in high voter turnout. You vote because you believe the community project is worth it.
But the reality today is bleak. Public trust in the U.S. federal government has absolutely plummeted over the last half-century.
In 1964, public trust was at a high of 77%. Today, it hovers near a dismal 20%.
When 80% of the public fundamentally believes the machine is corrupt, broken, or indifferent to their lives, they simply aren't going to take the time to show up, wait in line, and pull the lever.
Which is exactly why we need to look at how that machine is actually physically built. How do the gears connect? This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the mechanics of choice, the literal rules of the game.
And to remind ourselves of why any of this deeply cynical machinery actually matters, I think we should reflect on an incredibly powerful image from our research, looking back at Afghanistan in 2004.
It is a stunning historical moment. Against a terrifying backdrop of violent extremist threats, Taliban bombings, and severe adverse weather, the nation of Afghanistan held its first ever democratic presidential election.
Hamid Karzai was ultimately elected against 17 other candidates.
But what the global media broadcast to the world were these profound, unforgettable pictures of jubilant Afghan citizens, men and women, proudly holding up their thumbs, which had been stained with purple ink.
The ink was a low-tech security measure to prevent people from voting twice, but it became a badge of immense honor.
It proved they had risked their lives, defying the threat of violence, simply to cast a ballot. It is a profound, grounding reminder of the sacred, hard-won value of the vote, a value we often take for granted when we complain about a Tuesday line.
It truly grounds the conversation. The right to choose is paid for in blood. So how do these electoral systems physically operate to translate that choice into power?
In the United States, the system is based on geography. Voters are placed into defined electoral districts of roughly equal population.
For the House of Representatives, it's a system of single-member districts. Your specific geographic area elects one person to represent you. For the Senate, the entire state acts as one massive district, electing two people.
And the presidency is entirely unique. The president is not elected by a direct national popular vote, but through the Electoral College.
Each state is awarded a number of electors equal to their total number of senators and representatives combined.
But the massive catch the gear that shapes the entire strategy of a presidential campaign is the winner-take-all system utilized by 48 out of the 50 states.
Under this rule, if a candidate wins the popular vote in a state by one single solitary vote, they are awarded 100% of that state's electoral votes. Millions of votes for the losing candidate in that state effectively evaporate.
There are two fascinating exceptions to that rule. Maine and Nebraska use what is called the congressional district method.
They allocate one electoral vote to the winner of each specific congressional district within the state, and then the final two statewide electoral votes are awarded to the overall popular vote winner of the state.
It allows a state's electoral votes to be split, more accurately reflecting the divided will of the voters.
Now, when we look down ballot at how individual local races are won, the vast majority of U.S. elections rely on plurality rule.
This is a simple, brutal math equation. Whoever gets the most votes wins, period. Even if there are 3 candidates and the winner only gets 35% of the total vote, they still win the seat.
But some places, notably the state of Georgia, require majority rule. Under majority rule, you have to hit a mathematical threshold of 50% plus 1 vote to win.
If there are multiple candidates, and no one hits that 50% mark, it triggers a high-stakes runoff election between the top two vote-getters to ensure the ultimate winner has a true majority mandate.
The global contrast to the harsh plurality rule is a system called proportional representation, which is used widely across Europe.
In a proportional system, there are no single winner districts. Instead, if a political party wins 60% of the national popular vote, they are automatically awarded exactly 60% of the seats in the national legislature.
If a minority party gets 10% of the vote, they get 10% of the seats. The United States does not use this system at any level of government.
And this mechanical difference leads us to one of the most ironclad rules in political science, Duverger's law.
This is the Rosetta Stone for understanding American politics. Duverger's law mathematically explains why we only have two choices.
Exactly. Duverger's law states that plurality rule elections, utilizing single-member winner-take-all districts, inherently and inevitably create and protect a two-party system.
Why? Because of voter psychology. Voters are rational. They don't want to waste their vote on a third-party candidate who they know cannot possibly win the single seat available.
So they compromise. They vote for the lesser of two evils among the two major parties who actually stand a chance. Over time, third parties wither and die.
Conversely, proportional representation actively encourages vibrant multi-party systems because voters know that even if their niche party only gets 10% of the vote, they will still get 10% of the power in parliament. Every vote mathematically translates to representation.
It is fascinating. The invisible mathematical rules of the game completely dictate the menu of options you are handed on election day. Look at how Japan approaches this.
Their parliament, the Diet, uses a highly complex mixed system to try and get the best of both worlds.
Their House of Representatives uses plurality, voting for some seats, but also utilizes a closed-list proportional representation system. A closed list means you, the voter, don't vote for a specific person. You vote for the party brand, and the party bosses fill the seats with their loyalists.
But their upper chamber, the House of Councilors, uses an open list proportional system where you can actually pick a specific human candidate within the party list. It's a hybrid machine.
And again, stepping back to view the global spectrum of freedom, the mechanics vary wildly based on how much power the state wants to surrender. Thailand, for example, has a legislature where the lower house is elected by the people, but the entire Senate, the upper chamber that can block legislation, is entirely appointed by the nation's military, ensuring a permanent check on democratic reforms.
And in a totalitarian regime like North Korea, the mechanics are a dark parody of democracy. Voting is strictly compulsory, turnout is always reported at 99%, but there is absolutely no choice. There's only one state-approved candidate on the ballot. You vote to demonstrate submission, not to make a choice.
And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from North Korea, you have direct democracy. This is a mechanism that bypasses the politicians and representatives entirely and hands the steering wheel directly to the public.
You have the ballot initiative, which allows citizens to gather signatures and introduce a brand new law directly onto the ballot, like the citizens of Maryland, directly deciding if casino gambling should be legally allowed in their state.
You have the referendum, which asks voters to support or kill a controversial law that the legislature already passed.
And you have the recall, like we saw with Gavin Newsom in California, which allows angry voters to gather signatures and force a special election to end an elected official's term early.
26 U.S. states use some form of this direct democracy, empowering the citizens, as do 10 EU countries and Taiwan.
The final, massive piece of this structural puzzle is how campaigns themselves are regulated and run. The United States relies heavily on the concept of federalism, which means the national government mostly just oversees campaign finance and security, but leaves the actual physical mechanics of running the election to the 50 individual states.
This creates 50 different laboratories of democracy, but also 50 different sets of chaotic rules.
It's completely decentralized. Oregon, for instance, has been running all of its elections entirely by mail-in ballots since 1998, with massive success and high turnout.
Maine has completely abandoned plurality rule and uses ranked choice voting, where you rank the candidates 1, 2, 3, and the lowest is eliminated in rounds until someone hits a true 50% majority.
Meanwhile, you have states like Georgia fighting intense, bitter legislative battles over whether to allow voting on Sundays.
As opponents of those restrictions point out, banning Sunday voting historically and disproportionately impacts Black churchgoers' ability to organize traditional post-service souls-to-the-polls voting drives. Your ability to vote in the U.S. is entirely dependent on your zip code.
Contrast that decentralized, multi-billion-dollar, chaotic American system with a country like France. The French electoral machine is strict, centralized, and brief.
In France, official political campaigns are strictly limited by law to just 2 weeks. There are no 2-year grueling presidential campaigns.
The media is strictly regulated and can only air campaign information in a highly controlled 3-month window. And my favorite regulation, the night before the election, the French enforce a total, absolute media and polling blackout.
It is literally illegal to broadcast any electoral propaganda, polling data, or candidate interviews. The voters are given 24 hours of complete silence to think.
And crucially, to combat the economic bias we discussed earlier, the French state legally caps private donations and will actually reimburse candidates up to 50% of their certified election expenses, ensuring that you don't need to be a billionaire to run for office.
It's an entirely different philosophical approach to how a democracy should sound. It's heavily regulated, it's mercifully brief, and it's publicly funded to level the playing field. Britain is also totally unique. They don't have rigid 4-year election calendars.
They have snap elections. A sitting prime minister can call an election at almost any time to capitalize on good economic news or high polling. Tony Blair famously once announced his candidacy just 1 month before the actual election.
They have a flexible living calendar. Parliament simply dissolves after 5 years if an election hasn't been called. And if a prime minister loses the support of their own party coalition, the parliament can trigger a vote of no confidence, which instantly collapses the government and forces a brand new general election.
It is wild how profoundly different the democratic machine looks, sounds, and operates depending on where you are standing on the globe.
It truly is. We've covered a massive, sprawling amount of ground today. We started by digging into the foundational psychological theories of why human beings even bother to form interest groups, whether it's the natural optimism of pluralism, a sudden shocking disturbance in the societal force, or the cynical elite transactions in the VIP room.
We waded through the labyrinth of modern lobbying, tracing the money from the 25 women of Emily's List to the fast food defensive strategy of Taco Pack, all the way to the multi-billion-dollar dark money explosion of super PACs authorized by Citizens United.
We charted the evolution and perhaps the long-term global decline of traditional political parties as they face down a new era of highly polarized, populist, candidate-centered campaigns driven by shifting demographics.
And finally, we broke down the literal physical mechanics of the vote itself, from the incredibly brave purple-inked thumbs of Afghanistan to the strict state-mandated media blackouts of France.
It all connects into one massive ecosystem. The physical rules of the election dictate the power and structure of the political parties, which in turn defines the battlefield for the billions of dollars wielded by the interest groups. You cannot change one gear without turning the others.
Which brings us to our final thought.
We've seen today that alternative systems like proportional representation that guarantees third-party survival and strict state-funded campaign limits that level the playing field exist elsewhere in the world. And the data shows they seem to successfully boost both voter turnout and multi-party civic engagement.
But if we believe the math of Duvoger's law, the current American system's rules winner-take-all plurality voting, absolutely unlimited dark money, and fiercely decentralized state-by-state regulations inherently mathematically protect the two dominant political parties and the wealthiest elite interest groups.
So here's a thought for you to mull over as you go about your Went. If the massive, clanking machine of democracy is currently built specifically to protect the jobs and the power of the exact engineers who built it, will that system ever allow itself to be reformed from the inside out?
It is the ultimate, enduring paradox of democratic design.
It really is. Thank you for grabbing a flashlight and joining us on this incredibly dense journey under the hood. Take a close look at your own local gears of democracy this week, whether it's a fast food pack disclosure at the bottom of your receipt or the exhausted local poll workers setting up in your neighborhood school. We appreciate you taking this deep dive with us.
If you lift the hood of a car, you can see exactly how the engine works, right?
Right, yeah, the belts and spark plugs are all just right there.
Exactly. You trace the fuel line, you watch the belts turn, and you understand, exactly how that internal combustion makes the wheels move forward. It's all tangible.
It makes sense. It's precise.
But when you lift the hood on a national election, well, that visible machinery just completely vanishes. I mean, we all know that there are elections.
Oh, yeah, you can't escape them. The yard signs popping up like weeds everywhere.
The endless television commercials, the talking heads just screaming at each other on the nightly news. But how many of us actually understand the invisible underlying machinery? behind why people vote.
Or who they reliably vote for, yeah.
Right, and how politicians systematically manipulate the rules of the game to win, because it's a game with very specific rules.
Honestly, that's the perfect way to describe it. It's an entirely hidden architecture.
Which is why we're doing this.
Yeah, because what we experience as voters on the surface level is, well, it's pure noise and emotion. But underneath that noise, there's this very cold, very calculated, and deeply fascinating science operating.
And uncovering that exact science is why we are here today. Welcome to this deep dive. I'm thrilled you're joining us because today we have a very specific mission.
A really fun one, too.
Yes, we are taking a comprehensive academic source text, specifically Chapter 11, from a political science textbook, which is rather plainly titled Elections, and we're going to use it as a shortcut.
A shortcut to basically make you the most well-informed person in the room.
Exactly. Our goal today is to completely strip away all that partisan shouting, all the emotional bias you get from your social media feeds, and look strictly at the cold, hard data of electoral behavior.
It's just the facts.
Just the facts. We're treating this text as our undisputed blueprint. We'll look at the case studies it provides with complete impartiality. Democrats, Republicans, global parliamentary systems, it doesn't matter. We're just looking at the mechanics.
And I am so glad we're doing this, because I really love that phrasing of the election as an invisible machine.
It really fits, doesn't it?
It does. Because if we want to truly understand how a candidate wins an election at the very end of the process, we actually have to start much, much smaller.
Where do we start?
Well, before we can analyze the output of the machine, we have to look at the fuel.
Okay, the fuel.
Yeah, and in any democracy, the absolute baseline fuel is voter turnout. We have to start with the most basic puzzle of all, which is getting human beings to actually get off their couches, disrupt their daily routines, and show up to the polls.
So let's talk about that fuel. Because right out of the gate, the data in the text hits us with some numbers that are frankly staggering, especially when you look at them in a global context.
Oh, they really are.
Like, we hear so much rhetoric about the United States being the great beacon of modern democracy, right? The shining city on a hill.
That's the standard narrative.
But the data points out that the U.S. has a surprisingly massive problem getting its own citizens to actually participate in the process. The text notes that the peak voter turnout in the U.S., like the highest it has been in the modern era, was 63%.
And that was all the way back in 1960.
1960. And then by 2012, which was a highly contested, highly publicized presidential election, turnout was sitting at just 59%.
Yeah, under 60% for a major presidential race.
And when you look at non-presidential elections, you know, the midterms, it rarely even cracks 40%.
Right, but numbers in a vacuum don't really tell the whole story. To truly understand what a 59% turnout implies, the text provides us with a crucial comparative lens.
Right, looking at other countries.
Exactly. We look at countries like Sweden, Germany, and Italy. In those nations, voter turnout routinely tops 80%.
Wait, wow. Over 80% consistently.
Consistently. It's just the norm there. And then the text offers a profoundly moving historical example that puts the American numbers into, well, incredibly sharp relief.
Which one is that?
Black South Africans in 1994. When the apartheid regime fell and they were allowed to vote for the very first time, the voter turnout was a massive 86%.
Oh, wow. 86%.
Yeah. And the text uses this specific case study to illustrate how deeply a population appreciates the fundamental right to cast a ballot when that right has been, violently and systematically denied to them for generations.
So when you contrast that 86% turnout born of actual historical struggle with the 59% U.S. turnout, it forces political scientists to ask some very uncomfortable questions.
It really does. Like, what is going wrong?
So how do the researchers explain it? Because the data outlines two wildly different competing theories for why American turnout is so comparatively abysmal.
Yeah, it's a huge debate in the field.
On one hand, you have a school of thought that looks at these numbers and immediately sounds the alarm. They argue that low participation is a massive red flag.
Or the alienation theory.
Right. It means Americans are profoundly alienated. They are actively turning away from the political system because they feel it just doesn't represent them. And as a result, the entire democratic system is slowly losing its basic legitimacy.
That's the pessimistic view.
But then there's this fascinating opposing school of thought that looks at the exact same data and is completely unworried.
Yes, this is often referred to as the satisfaction theory.
Satisfaction.
Yeah. This second camp argues that low turnout doesn't mean the system is failing at all. In fact, it means the system is working so adequately that people are basically satisfied with the status quo.
They're just fine with how things are going.
Right. Or at the very least, they aren't experiencing enough acute pain or dissatisfaction in their daily lives to go through the physical trouble of registering and voting.
That feels like a stretch.
Well, this school of thought even goes so far as to suggest that countries experiencing extremely high voter turnouts might actually be suffering from a sort of political fever.
Political fever, what does that mean?
Like, partisan politics has simply become too intense, too overheated, and just too central to daily survival. If everyone is voting, it means everyone is terrified of what happens if they don't.
Okay, wait, hold on. Quiet satisfaction. I have to play devil's advocate here because that really doesn't track with what we are seeing in the data on the ground.
Fair enough. Let's look at the data.
The text explicitly notes that more than half of U.S. non-voters state they were either entirely uninterested in or outright dissatisfied with the candidates offered to them.
True.
Many of these non-voters express a belief that their individual vote makes zero difference or that the choices are just universally poor. When half the people staying home are essentially saying they hate the options, that isn't satisfaction. That sounds like active resignation to me. How do these researchers justify that?
It is a totally valid critique, and it's exactly why the text moves beyond just measuring psychological apathy.
Right.
It points out that we cannot just blame the mindset of the American voter without meticulously detailing the structural friction that is literally built into the American system.
Ah, the actual mechanics of voting.
Right. Let's look at the first hurdle, which is registration. In most of Europe, the text notes, voter registration is largely an automatic process. When a citizen turns 18, the local government authorities simply register them. The state takes on the administrative burden.
That makes total sense.
But in the United States, that burden is placed entirely on the individual citizen. Americans must register personally, and they often have to complete this paperwork months before the actual election.
Long before anyone is even really paying attention.
Exactly, long before the excitement and media coverage of the campaign has even really mounted.
That makes perfect sense. It's exactly like the difference between a subscription service that auto-renews versus one where the company forces you to physically print and mail in a form 3 months in advance just to keep getting the product.
That's a great analogy.
Of course, the auto-renew system is going to have vastly higher retention rates. You are removing the friction.
Exactly. And the friction in the U.S. system does not stop at registration. Consider the physical day we ask people to vote. The text highlights that U.S. elections are held on Tuesdays.
A Tuesday?
Yeah, for the vast majority of the population, that is a normal, busy working day. You're commuting, working 8 hours, picking up kids.
Just trying to get through the week.
Right. In much of Europe, they hold their elections on Sundays. That's a day historically associated with rest and community, making it significantly easier to find the time.
Right. Think about your last Tuesday. By 6 p.m., after commuting, dealing with your boss, and figuring out dinner, how much mental energy do you actually have left to go stand in a line at a middle school gymnasium?
Usually none.
None. And that brings up the next structural hurdle the text mentions, the American ballot itself.
Ah, yes, the infamous long ballot.
It's so long.
The text describes how U.S. voters, once they finally make it to the voting booth, are faced with this bafflingly long, complex document. It is filled with national candidates, state representatives, local judges, school board members.
And those incredibly dense, legally confusing referendums.
Exactly. Contrast that cognitive load with European ballots, which the text describes as astonishingly simple. They often just ask the voter to make a single choice of a preferred political party.
Just one choice. And we cannot ignore the psychological environment surrounding that ballot either. The text points out that American television saturates voters with political advertising for months, sometimes years in advance.
It never stops.
And this advertising increasingly relies on primitive, dirty, highly negative political spots. The result is that by election day, a significant portion of the electorate is thoroughly disgusted with both parties.
Yeah, they're just burnt out.
Whereas many European countries, by contrast, heavily control, regulate, or outright limit television political advertising. Some allow none at all.
So when you aggregate all of these factors, the personal administrative burden of registering, the inconvenience of a Tuesday, the immense mental tax of a complicated long ballot, and the emotional drain of a relentlessly negative media environment,
It's a lot.
you start to realize that voting in America is highly expensive in terms of time and energy.
Which is the perfect entry point into one of the most fascinating concepts in the text. We are talking about Anthony Downs and his landmark 1957 work, An economic theory of democracy.
Yes, Anthony Downs.
Because if voting has an actual cost, then we have to apply economics to it. Walk me through this rational choice theory of voting.
Well, Downs argued that we shouldn't look at voters as purely civic-minded idealists. Instead, he proposed we look at them through a very cold, rational economic lens.
Okay, so treating them like accountants.
Pretty much, people will vote if and only if the expected returns outweigh the anticipated costs. The costs are exactly what we just listed. The financial and personal cost of gathering political information, the physical energy required to attend local meetings, the money lost by taking time off work on a Tuesday.
All very real costs. And on the other side?
On the other side of the ledger are the returns. These are the tangible stakes of the election.
So give me an example of how those returns manifest in the real world.
The text gives a highly practical example regarding local taxes. Imagine property owners in a town who fear a proposed tax hike. They have a very high, immediate economic incentive to vote.
Because it hits their wallet directly.
Exactly. The returns protecting their own bank accounts from higher taxes are crystal clear. They will happily pay the cost of voting to secure that return.
Right.
Renters in that same town, however, aren't immediately or directly hurt by that specific property tax line item. Their tangible stakes are much lower. And therefore, according to Downs's math, they are significantly less likely to endure the friction of voting.
But here's where it gets really interesting and where Downs's strict mathematical approach seems to hit a brick wall.
The paradox.
Yeah. Downs says that when you are calculating those returns, you have to factor in the statistical probability of your single individual vote actually being the deciding factor in the election.
Which is essentially zero.
Exactly. In a national U.S. election with over 100 million voters, it's functionally zero. So if I am doing the strict rational choice math, the costs are incredibly real. My time, my energy, sitting in Tuesday traffic.
Yep.
But the return is multiplied by a literal 0% chance of being the deciding vote. It is like buying a lottery ticket where the cost is an hour of your day, but the jackpot is just keeping things exactly the same.
That's a really good way of putting it.
So if the math explicitly says my individual vote does not matter, how does political science explain the millions of people who stubbornly do show up?
That is the exact paradox that Downs's theory forces the field of political science to confront. If we look strictly at the tangible costs versus the statistical probability of casting the deciding vote, nobody should ever vote. It is economically irrational.
So how do we fix the math?
To make the math work, to explain the tens of millions who do show up, the text explains that we have to introduce intangible returns into the equation. We have to include the concept of civic duty.
Civic duty.
Yeah.
So just the feeling of doing the right thing.
Yes, the internal, personal, psychological satisfaction created by participating in the democratic process.
So it's not just about the tax policy, it's about feeling like a good citizen.
Precisely. And, interestingly enough, the text adds another psychological factor, which is uncertainty about being the deciding vote.
Oh, like people actually think they might be the tiebreaker.
Even if the rational math says it is impossible, the human brain holds on to that tiny, irrational sliver of uncertainty. Like, what if it comes down to one vote?
Right.
So showing up to the polls isn't just a cold calculation of municipal zoning laws. It's a complex calculation of personal identity, civic fulfillment, and psychological hope.
So if the math is this brutal, if it actively punishes you for taking the time to vote, and requires a strong sense of internal civic duty to overcome, who are these millions of people stubbornly showing up anyway?
Well, there has to be a specific type of person who clears that hurdle.
This brings us to the demographics of democracy.
It does. But before the text allows us to dive into the specific demographic breakdowns, it pauses to give us a crucial lesson in academic methodology. And this is vital for how we consume any kind of political data.
Okay, lay it on me.
The text explicitly warns against making what it calls causal statements. In the hard sciences, you can often say definitively that X causes Y, heat water to 100 degrees Celsius, and it boils.
Sure.
But in the social sciences, human behavior is vastly too complex for that.
Right, because humans aren't water molecules. The text emphasizes that everything we are about to discuss regarding voter behavior is multi-causal. It is never just one thing. It is variables P, Q, and R all tangling together in a messy web to eventually lead to outcome Z.
Exactly. So instead of using causal statements, the text trains us to use tendency statements.
Tendency statement.
Like, we don't say being wealthy makes you a voter, as if it's a law of physics. We say if we observe X, then we usually find Y, or wealthier people tend to vote more frequently. We were always talking about probabilities and aggregations, not absolute certainties.
I'm really glad we laid that ground rule. So, with that methodological caveat firmly in place, what does the data actually tell us?
Well, the text lays out the broad profile of the typical high turnout voter in most modern democracies.
And they tend to hit several specific markers, right? They are middle-aged, they are better educated, they generally hold white-collar jobs, and they live in urban or suburban areas rather than rural
That's
ones.
the baseline profile, yeah.
Conversely, the profile of the chronic non-voter shows the exact reverse. They tend to be younger, lacking formal higher education, holding blue-collar jobs, or facing unemployment.
Let's drill down into two of those specific variables, though. Income and education. The text notes these two are deeply intertwined.
Because education usually leads to better paying jobs.
Historically, yes. Higher education usually leads to higher income, so they reinforce each other's effects. High income gives people that tangible stake in the election outcome we just discussed with Downs.
The taxes, regulations, property laws, it hits the wallet.
Exactly. But the text introduces a fascinating psychological concept here to explain why these groups vote more, and it is called efficacy.
Efficacy. Explain how that works in this context.
Efficacy is defined in the text as the feeling that one actually has at least a little power to affect change. The text provides a great contrast here. Take a factory worker living in a small industrial town.
Okay.
They go to work, they pay their taxes, they follow the laws, but frankly, they see very little change in their day-to-day life, regardless of whether a Democrat or a Republican is sitting in the White House.
And nothing really trickles down to change their routine.
Right. Consequently, their internal sense of efficacy is incredibly low. They view political life as belonging to a silent majority, where people like them rarely have the organized wealth or political access to pressure the government.
But if you contrast that with a corporate executive or a high-level professional, their reality is entirely different.
Completely different.
They see a direct, visible line between government policy and their personal fortunes. They have likely seen industry lobbying groups successfully change regulations that directly benefited them.
Which means they have high efficacy, they genuinely feel their voice and their vote actually matters.
Precisely. They feel agency. But just as the text establishes this neat correlation between education, income, and efficacy, it throws a massive wrench into the gears.
Oh, the education puzzle.
I love this part. Okay, so the text states that numerous repeated studies show that an individual's level of education is the single strongest determinant of whether they will vote.
That's the data.
So logically, if a nation's overall education level goes up, voter turnout should skyrocket, right? But the data shows that historically in the United States, voter turnout actually declined during the exact same period that U.S. educational levels dramatically historically climbed.
Yeah, it's wild.
Millions more people getting college degrees, but fewer people voting. Why didn't the math work?
The text offers several potential theories to explain this puzzle, acknowledging that, none are entirely definitive. The first theory is a bit cynical, but mathematically sound. A college degree simply might not mean what it used to mean.
So it's credential inflation.
Exactly. The text argues that in terms of entering the modern job market and the social status it confers, a bachelor's degree today functions much like a high school diploma did before World War II.
So it's just the new baseline.
Right. Furthermore, the nature of education has changed. Many modern degrees are highly vocational or narrowly career-focused.
Okay, meaning what?
This means that while a student is highly trained in a specific skill, their education doesn't necessarily awaken the broad, abstract intellectual curiosity or the deep knowledge of national and world affairs that traditionally drove civic participation in the past.
That tracks. A specialized degree in software engineering or supply chain management doesn't inherently force you to care about municipal zoning laws or foreign policy. But I want to look at another theory the text brings up to solve this puzzle, and it is called post-materialism.
This is a major cultural theory.
Walk us through it.
The text describes post-materialism as a fundamental shift occurring in advanced industrialized nations. As societies move away from heavy manufacturing and transition into knowledge and information-based economies, the text argues that this economic shift brings about a profound change in human values.
A change towards what?
Well, specifically, a shift away from focusing on the broader society and toward a deep, intense focus on the self.
The text goes pretty hard on this. It literally states that in this new age, only personal things matter to this highly educated demographic. Relationships, maintaining a correct diet, outdoor activities, music.
Right.
It suggests that broad social and political questions simply no longer interest people whose basic material needs are already met. But wait, hold on. Let me push back on this reading of the data.
Go for it.
If people are obsessed with correct diets or protecting the environment for their outdoor activities, isn't that just a new kind of politics?
Mm.
Isn't choosing to buy organic, locally sourced food or choosing to drive an electric car a deeply political act in the modern era?
That is a very astute modern pushback. You are pointing out that political expression hasn't disappeared. It has simply mutated into consumer choices and lifestyle activism.
Right, a boycott instead of a ballot.
But in the strict historical context of the text, post-materialism is offered as a specific reason why higher education no longer guarantees traditional voter turnout at the ballot box.
Oh, I see.
If highly educated people are directing all of their political energy toward personal optimization, lifestyle choices, and consumer activism rather than traditional institutional engineering, like joining a political party or attending town halls, the raw turnout numbers will inevitably drop.
That makes sense. It's a shift in the venue of politics, not necessarily the death of it.
Exactly. Let's look at two other massive demographic variables that the text highlights when exploring who votes: age and race.
Okay, let's start with age.
Regarding age, the text notes a fascinating historical test case. In 1971, the United States ratified the 26th Amendment, which officially lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18.
And franchising millions of young people overnight.
Yes, but somewhat predictably to political scientists, giving 18-year-olds the franchise didn't magically make them use it.
Because they lack that efficacy and tangible stake we talked about.
Exactly. The text points out that people under 25 typically have little disposable income, they don't own property, and they feel economically unmoored. It isn't until they get older, secure a career, and start paying significant income and property taxes that their interest in government policy suddenly spikes.
Because now they have something to lose.
Yes. The data shows that middle-aged people who are at their peak earning power care deeply about tax policy. And older voters become intensely concerned with government safety nets like Social Security and Medicare.
In fact, the text notes that in recent U.S. elections, voters over the age of 70 showed the absolute highest turnout rates of any demographic group.
Which perfectly aligns with the Downsian economic model.
And when we look at the variable of race, the text details a very significant, hard-fought historical shift.
A massive one.
For a long time in U.S. history, African-American voting rates were substantially, artificially lower than white voting rates due to systemic, legal, and violent barriers. But the text cites the 1965 Voting Rights Act as the pivotal legislative moment that finally began dismantling those barriers, particularly in the American South.
And it is crucial to note, as the text does, that it wasn't just the stroke of a legislative pen that changed the numbers. The legislation allowed for a massive process of political consciousness raising within the African American community over the ensuing decades.
So it was a gradual buildup of efficacy.
Exactly. This steady generational organizing culminated in a monumental demographic shift. The text highlights that in the 2012 election, African-American voter turnout actually edged past white turnout for the first time.
Wow.
A historical trend that was heavily accelerated by the historic candidacy of Barack Obama.
So we have established who is doing the Downsian math. We know who is successfully paying the cost to turn up to the polls.
The demographic profile is clear.
But understanding that they vote isn't enough. We need to understand the invisible psychological forces guiding their hands once they actually step into the voting booth. This brings us to the blueprint of beliefs and how all these demographic realities form long-term loyalties.
Right, because to understand how people actually make their choice on the ballot, the text introduces the foundational bedrock of political science. It's called partisan identification, or party ID for short.
Party ID.
The text describes party ID as a deep psychological attachment that many people feel toward one specific political party for a very long time, sometimes for their entire lives.
And this connects beautifully back to Anthony Downs' theory about the costs of voting, doesn't it?
It really does. The text frames party ID as the ultimate cognitive shortcut. Think about the massive time and energy costs it would take for a voter to become deeply informed on every single candidate, every single judge, and every single issue on that long American ballot we discussed.
It's exhausting. Nobody has time for that.
Nobody. But if you have a strong party ID, you don't have to do all that research. You have a standing decision. You see the D or the R next to a name, and your brain instantly does the math for you.
It is remarkably similar to being a lifelong fan of a sports team. Let's expand on that. You might inherit that fandom from your parents early in life. Just as the text says, party ID is very often inherited from your family, almost like a religion.
Yes, very much so.
And who is the kicker? Even if the star players, the candidates, change completely, even if the team has a terrible season, even if you vehemently disagree with the coach's new strategy, you still wear the jersey.
You're still a fan.
Right. And more importantly, you don't even need to know the opposing team's quarterback stats to know you were supposed to boo him. It saves you the energy of evaluation.
That analogy holds up perfectly with how the text describes voter behavior. Strong party identifiers habitually, reliably vote for their party.
Which makes sense.
And from a systemic level, this is incredibly important. It anchors the entire democratic system. It provides electoral stability, allowing politicians to roughly anticipate what the public wants without having to start from scratch every election cycle.
But the text draws a very sharp, necessary line between these deep, long-term variables like party ID and short-term variables.
Right, because elections aren't entirely static. If everyone just voted their party ID, the results would literally never change.
The text gives some fascinating historical examples of these short-term variables, events so powerful they can temporarily sway a weak identifier or an independent.
Yeah, the text highlights Margaret Thatcher in the UK. She deliberately called elections in 1983 specifically to catch the patriotic glow of the military victory in the Falklands.
A huge short-term boost.
Exactly. She did it again in 1987 to capitalize on a temporary economic upswing.
In the U.S., the text points to Jimmy Carter in 1976. He heavily benefited from a short-term morality factor following the intense public disgust over the Watergate scandal, or more recently, the severe economic downturn in 2008, which severely hurt the incumbent Republican Party regardless of long-term loyalties.
These short-term events, wars, scandals, recessions, they can cause a massive temporary swing in an election. But the crucial point the text makes is that they rarely result in a permanent, lifelong shift in a voter's underlying party ID. Once the crisis passes, they often revert to their inherited jersey.
And when you aggregate millions of these individual party IDs, you get what political scientists refer to as voting blocks. Now, circling back to our methodology lesson about tendency statements, the text warns us that a voting block is never a monolith.
There is no such thing as a 100% solid block.
But if more than half of a specific social category reliably votes for a party, the text considers that a significant relationship. If 3/4 do, it is a very strong relationship. Let's look at how the data breaks down these blocks, starting with class and region.
Class voting is a classic pillar of political analysis, but the text points out that it is actually receding in importance almost everywhere in the industrialized world.
Really? How so?
It used to be very simple. Working-class wage earners voted for the left-wing or labor parties, and better-off professionals and executives voted for the right-wing or conservative parties. But the text highlights a modern phenomenon it calls the two-way crossover that has completely muddied the waters.
Explain the crossover.
Well, on one side, you increasingly have working-class people voting conservative. This might be due to long-standing family tradition, or more likely because they hold traditional, non-economic social convictions that align with conservative platforms.
Okay, and the other side.
On the other side, you have middle and upper-class professionals voting for the left, often because of progressive social views they picked up during their extended time in higher education. So the simple wealth-to-vote pipeline is broken.
What about region? How does geography dictate party ID?
Region is equally complex and fascinating. The text talks about center-periphery tensions.
What does that mean?
Often, outlying regional provinces harbor deep generational economic and cultural resentments toward rule by a distant, disconnected capital city.
Like the Hunger Games, but with voting.
Essentially, yes. The text cites Scotland, which has historically resented London, particularly over the control of oil revenues, resulting in strong regional support for the Scottish National Party. Or in Germany, where the text notes ongoing cultural and economic friction between the Osses in the former East and the Wesses in the West.
And in the U.S., the text traces the profound evolution of the American South. This is a massive geographic block shift.
A textbook example.
Following the Civil War, the South was solidly, fiercely Democratic because they harbored deep resentment toward the Yankee Republicans of Abraham Lincoln. But through a slow evolution we will discuss later, it has shifted completely to become the strongest, most reliable Republican regional bloc today. Geography is destiny until it isn't.
Exactly. And then the text dives into race, ethnicity, and religion. To illustrate this, it provides a very clinical, data-driven case study of the 2012 U.S. presidential election.
The numbers here are incredibly stark and revealing about how modern coalitions are built. Let's look at those 2012 numbers impartially.
Okay.
The text notes that minority voters are a rapidly growing electoral force, making up 28% of the total electorate in that cycle. In that specific election, the data shows Barack Obama won an overwhelming 93% of the black vote and 71% of the Hispanic vote.
Very strong blocks.
Mitt Romney, the Republican challenger, won 59% of the white vote and captured the vast majority of white Protestant evangelicals.
The text is very analytical about this demographic reality. It points out that because the white vote is much more divided than minority voting blocks, political scientists are forced to look for microblocks within that larger demographic to understand who will actually win.
And this is where the text introduces the emergence of what it calls the gaps. Let's break down these gaps. First up is the gender gap.
Right. Historically, the text notes women were viewed by political scientists as more traditional and actually voted more conservatively than men. Yes, but in recent decades, that dynamic has entirely reversed. In the U.S. and several other Western democracies, women now reliably vote for Democratic or left-leaning parties by margins of several percentage points more than their male counterparts.
Then there is the marriage gap, which the text says observers really started paying close attention to around the year 2000.
This one is fascinating.
The data shows that unmarried people lean Democratic by several points, whereas married couples lean heavily conservative. The text theorizes that the immense financial and personal responsibilities of raising a family naturally make voters more conservative, heavily aligning with the Republican stress on family values.
In fact, the text drops a really fascinating statistical nugget here.
Yeah.
If you remove single people from the data and only compare married men to married women, the gender gap we just talked about largely disappears.
Wow. It is a stunning realization of how overlapping these variables are.
It really is. And finally, the text discusses the gay gap. 2012 was a landmark year for political data because, for the first time ever, national exit polls explicitly asked voters about their sexual orientation.
And what were the numbers?
5% of the electorate identified as gay, and of those voters, 3/4 voted for Obama. The text makes a pointed observation. Minus this specific, heavily concentrated 5% block, the overall voting strength between the two major candidates was essentially even.
So it was the deciding factor.
This suggests that this relatively small demographic gap may have actually provided the narrow margin of victory.
Okay, but this brings up a major point of pushback for me regarding the entire concept of banking on these specific voting blocks.
What's your pushback?
The text explicitly states that, according to the U.S. Census, by the year 2043, there will be absolutely no majority race in the United States. African Americans, Hispanics, whites, every group will be a minority. If the demographics of the nation are shifting that rapidly and that fundamentally, doesn't relying on these traditional voting blocks become a very dangerous, obsolete game for politicians to play? If the sports teams are constantly changing cities, changing mascots, and changing the rules, at some point, the old loyalties have to break down, right?
It is a massive, critical vulnerability in modern campaign strategy, and the text fully acknowledges this looming reality.
So what do they do?
It states very clearly that if a political party fails to find a way to win votes across these shifting demographic lines, if they cannot appeal beyond their traditional shrinking base, they will eventually be mathematically dominated.
They'll just lose.
However, it also notes that political parties are historically very, very good at adapting to survive over time. They don't just sit still while the math changes. They evolve to capture entirely new coalitions.
But here's the thing. All of these demographic intentions, all these carefully calculated party IDs, all these cognitive shortcuts and efficacy calculations, they are entirely, utterly meaningless if the physical mechanical system recording them is broken.
Right, the actual machine.
If the machine doesn't count the fuel, the car doesn't move. Which leads us to the mechanics of voting. We are moving from the theoretical desires of the voters to the cold, hard, and sometimes deeply flawed physical reality of how a democracy actually counts those desires.
The text opens its analysis of voting mechanics with a very sobering, fundamental premise. No electoral system on Earth can guarantee translating the public's will into governance in a way that is both perfectly fair and perfectly simple. It is an unavoidable trade-off.
Explain that trade-off. Why can't we have both?
Because the math fights itself. If an electoral system prioritizes being highly fair, like proportional representation systems found in parts of Europe.
Where winning 10% of the national vote guarantees your party 10% of the seats in the legislature.
Exactly. It ensures minority voices are heard. That is fair.
Huh.
But it is mathematically complex. It leads to fragmented coalition governments and is not simple.
Okay, and the flip side.
Conversely, if a system prioritizes being simple, like the single-member districts in the U.S., where whoever gets the most votes in a specific geographic area wins the one seat and everyone else gets nothing, it is very easy to understand. But it is inherently not fair to minority viewpoints because 49% of the voters in that district get zero representation.
To illustrate a system failing catastrophically on both fairness and simplicity, the text dives incredibly deep into the 2000 U.S. presidential election. It describes it as a double disaster waiting to happen.
Yes, the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush exposed the invisible machinery of the system like never before. The first disaster was at the macro system level.
With the popular vote.
Right. Al Gore won the popular vote across the nation by over 500,000 votes. More human beings wanted him to be president. But due to the math of the Electoral College, he lost the electoral count 271 to 266, handing the presidency to Bush. The system's rules overrode the raw popular will.
But the second disaster, which the text spends a lot of time on, was the micromechanics. The actual physical balloting mechanism in a crucial state completely melted down. Let's talk about Florida.
Specifically, Palm Beach County.
Because elections in the United States are highly decentralized, there is no single national way to vote. Individual counties use whatever balloting system they happen to choose, regardless of its age or technological quality. The text notes that in 2000, Palm Beach County was using an incredibly cheap 40-year-old technology, IBM-type punch cards.
Let's visualize how this machine actually works, because it's vital to understanding the failure. Voters were handed a stiff card. They had to slide it into a mechanical frame, read a booklet, take a metal stylus, and physically punch out a tiny, perforated rectangular piece of cardboard known as a CHAD next to their candidate's name.
And here is where the physical reality destroys the democratic ideal. The text notes that on thousands of ballots, up to 6% in some areas, these little pieces of cardboard were not completely dislodged by the stylus. They were hanging chads.
Hanging by a thread.
They were clinging by one or two corners. So when these physical cards were taken and run through the optical counting machines, the laser couldn't pass through the hole. The machine read it as a blank ballot. A no vote.
Just completely ignored.
Imagine going to all the effort to overcome Down's costs of voting. You do your civic duty, and your intention is completely erased from history because a tiny piece of cardboard didn't fall to the floor. And the text points out that it gets even worse. The ballot design itself was a psychological nightmare.
The infamous butterfly ballot.
Yes.
The text explains that the local election official designed a two-page layout that was so visually confusing with arrows pointing in bizarre directions that many voters in this heavily reliably Democratic county accidentally punched the hole for the right-wing populist candidate, Pat Buchanan, instead of Al Gore.
It was a pure user interface failure.
And what happened when voters realized they punched the wrong hole?
What did they do?
They panicked. They tried to fix their error by punching a second hole for Gore. But the counting machine was programmed to instantly invalidate any ballot with multiple votes for president. It threw the entire ballot out.
Wow.
The text estimates that this combination of mechanical failure and horrific visual design lost Al Gore an estimated 20,000 votes in that single county.
20,000.
To put that in perspective, that was several times more than the incredibly thin margin he needed to win the state of Florida and therefore the entire presidency. A tiny county's bad design altered global history.
The text then deliberately contrasts this high-tech mechanical nightmare with the Canadian electoral system. And the difference is staggering. The Canadian ballot, as described in the text, is a simple piece of paper. It is marked with a pencil.
Very low-tech.
It is visually clear. It is completely standard across the entire nation. It is bilingual. And because it is so straightforward, it is hand-counted by human beings nationwide in just 4 hours.
4 hours?
Now, I have to pause here. Is it possible to be too simple? If we are just talking about graphite pencil marks on a piece of paper, isn't that inherently vastly easier to physically tamper with or erase than a digital touchscreen system or a complex optical scanner? Why does the academic text seem to vastly prefer this low-tech approach?
It is a great question. The text preference for the Canadian system roots back to the fundamental concepts of standardization and verifiable transparency. While modern digital systems might seem secure and high-tech, they're proprietary, they're incredibly complex, and they are highly vulnerable to software bugs, calibration errors, or hacking that are entirely invisible to the naked human eye.
You can't see the code changing your vote.
Exactly. A paper ballot, physically marked with a pencil, however, leaves an undeniable physical historical trail.
An audit trail.
If there is a dispute or a recount, human eyes from competing parties can look at the physical graphite on the paper and clearly ascertain the voter's intent. It entirely avoids the mechanical ambiguity of a hanging chad or the invisible failure of a software glitch.
So paper is just safer.
The text argues that in an election, prioritizing absolute clarity and a universally verifiable human standard is far more secure than relying on opaque technological complexity.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Transparency over technology. Let's look back up from the ballots to the macro-level disaster of that 2000 election, the Electoral College.
Yes.
The text does not pull its punches here, literally calling it an undemocratic anachronism.
It's a strong phrase for an academic text.
It explains that the system was fundamentally designed to mathematically overrepresent states with very small populations. The rules state that every single state, regardless of how few people live there, gets 2 senators, plus their proportional representatives. This means even the tiniest state is guaranteed a baseline of at least 3 electoral votes.
And the text breaks down the stark math of what that baseline actually does.
Yeah.
Because of that guaranteed minimum, a single vote cast for president in a thinly populated state like Wyoming is mathematically worth almost 4 times the electoral power of a single vote cast in a massively populous state like California.
And the text points out the very real partisan reality of this math today. Small, thinly populated states in the middle of America tend to reliably vote Republican, while populous states with massive urban centers on the coasts tend to reliably vote Democrat.
It builds a baked-in advantage.
Furthermore, because almost all states award their electoral votes on a strict winner-take-all basis, the system incentivizes bizarre behavior. Winning a state by 2 million votes gives a candidate absolutely no more electoral advantage than winning it by a single vote. It completely severs the direct connection between the total popular will and the final electoral result.
And yet, it is a system that is almost impossible to change. The text notes that reforming or abolishing the Electoral College requires a constitutional amendment, which needs 3/4 of the states to ratify it.
Which will never happen.
Right, because those 17 small population states that massively benefit from being overrepresented have the mathematical power to entirely block any reform efforts.
But the text is impartial, and it does provide the rigorous academic counterargument for keeping it. Why do some political scientists defend this bizarre math?
Defenders of the Electoral College argue that relying purely on a national popular vote is not the magical democratic fix people think it is, especially in a highly fractured race with strong third-party candidates.
Give us an example.
The text cites the 1992 U.S. presidential election to illustrate this danger. Bill Clinton won a solid 69% of the Electoral College. That massive electoral victory gave him a clear, undeniable mandate to govern the nation.
But what was the popular vote?
Here is the catch. Because a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, took an astonishing 19% of the national vote, Clinton actually only won 43% of the popular vote. The text argues that without the artificial magnifying effect of the Electoral College, creating a clear winner, you would have a president entering office knowing that 57% of the country explicitly voted against him.
The text also uses an international comparison to highlight the very real dangers of these fractured proportional results, pointing to the 2010 British parliamentary elections.
Right, the hung parliament.
That election produced a situation where no single party held a clear majority of seats. In the U.S., the rigid separation of powers means the president can still technically govern and run the executive branch even without congressional majorities.
But in a parliamentary system, a hung parliament forces parties to build fragile, often unstable coalitions just to keep the government running.
So the Electoral College, for all its mathematical flaws, is designed to definitively end the argument and produce a clear executive.
Exactly. So when we step back, we see that the mechanics of the system, from the literal design of the ballots to the constitutional weighting of states, create a very rigid, highly specific playing field.
Which brings us to a vital existential question. If the system is this incredibly rigid and heavily favors very specific geographic and demographic coalitions, how do political parties survive for centuries without going extinct?
They have to adapt.
They can't just keep playing the same hand if the demographics shift. They have to mutate.
And that leads directly into the theory of electoral realignment. Because the rules of the game are so inflexible, the political parties themselves have to periodically undergo massive tectonic shifts to capture enough new votes to win. The text dives deep into this, identifying two distinct flavors of realignment: critical and secular.
Let's start with critical realignment. This sounds like an earthquake.
It is. The theory of critical elections posits that while people usually retain their psychological party ID for decades, history occasionally produces watershed moments. These are elections where a sudden massive shift occurs, entire voting blocks switch sides, and the fundamental terms of political debate are reset in a single cycle.
The text lists the classic critical elections in U.S. history, right?
Yes. 1800 with Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, 1828 with Jacksonian Populist Democrats, 1860 with Lincoln Republicans emerging over the issue of slavery, 1896 with the rise of business republicanism,
And 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal Democrats entirely reshaping the government's role in the economy.
Exactly. After these sudden political earthquakes, the tectonic plates settle, and a new normal vote is established for the next several decades.
But then the text presents the alternative theory, secular realignment. This theory argues that shifts are rarely sudden, dramatic earthquakes. Instead, they are slow, grinding, generational erosions in response to entirely new issues.
They take years, sometimes decades, to become fully apparent in the data.
And the text uses the modern American South as the absolute perfect example of this slow-motion mutation.
The South didn't flip from Democrat to Republican overnight. The text traces the very beginning of this monumental shift all the way back to 1948.
1948.
That was the year Democratic President Harry Truman ordered the desegregation of the U.S. military, which deeply alienated conservative Southern white voters who had been loyal to the party since the Civil War.
But they didn't all instantly become Republicans. The text shows how the shift continued at a glacial pace through the 1960s, driven by conservative reactions against the Civil Rights Act, championed by Democratic President Lyndon Johnson.
The shift gained further momentum in the 1980s, with Ronald Reagan aggressively courting socially conservative voters.
But it didn't fully culminate in a complete regional takeover until the Republican sweep of Congress in 1994. That is almost a 50-year process of secular realignment. It is a slow, methodical rewiring of the electorate.
It is a remarkable historical timeline. And while some political scientists argue fiercely about whether a realignment is critical or secular, the text notes that other researchers suggest we should throw the whole theory out the window.
Throw it out? Why?
They argue we aren't experiencing realignment at all. We are currently experiencing delignment.
Delignment, meaning the entire concept of party ID is falling apart. The text notes that back in 1948, fewer than a fifth of U.S. voters called themselves political independents. Today, that number has surged to about a third of the electorate rejecting party labels.
The text ties this delignment directly to a profound generational loss of trust in institutions, citing very specific historical traumas.
Which traumas?
Well, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson campaigned on a promise not to send American boys to fight in Vietnam, and then he immediately escalated the war. In 1974, voters watched Richard Nixon resign in unprecedented disgrace over the Watergate cover-up.
And more recently?
In 2003, the government assured the public there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there weren't. The text argues this compounded, repeated trauma over decades shattered the faith of an entire generation in conventional party politics and the establishment.
However, the text also provides a very skeptical counter-argument to this idea of a glorious rise of the independent voter.
Right, some behavioral researchers look at the voting data and say the true independent is largely a myth.
A myth.
They argue that when you track actual voting behavior over time, most people who proudly call themselves independent actually reliably lean toward and consistently vote for one specific party.
They just don't like the label.
Exactly. When you strip away what people call themselves and look exclusively at what they do in the booth, these researchers claim that only about 15% of voters are genuine swing voting neutrals. And paradoxically, those true neutrals tend to be the demographic that votes the least frequently.
So functionally, the bedrock of party ID might be largely unchanged. People just find the label embarrassing now.
That's what the data suggests.
But whether people publicly admit to a party ID or not, the text highlights a much more alarming structural trend in the electorate: partisan polarization. The data shows that the electorate is actively, aggressively fleeing the center and forming two deeply hostile, entrenched camps.
The text lists several multi-causal factors for this shift. First, it points to the rise of elite ideological agendas.
What does that look like?
Over the last few decades, new think tanks, specialized periodicals, and partisan websites, particularly starting on the conservative side and then spreading across the spectrum, began formulating and pushing hardline ideological positions.
Positions the parties used to avoid.
Right. These were extreme positions that the big tent political parties used to actively avoid in their historical quest to capture the moderate center.
Second, the text highlights a fascinating geographic phenomenon known as the big sort. Mobile Americans are increasingly physically moving their lives to ZIP codes that culturally and ideologically suit them.
They're sorting themselves.
This creates massive regions that are ideologically pure. The text notes the South becoming a purely conservative monolith and the Northeast becoming purely liberal. The result is that neighbors no longer casually interact with people who think differently than they do at the grocery store or the PTA meeting.
Third is the profound impact of the culture wars, which the text notes are based heavily on the variable of religiosity. Highly religious voters rapidly rallied to the moral values espoused by one party, while secular or less religious voters rallied to the issues of social equality and tax fairness espoused by the other.
The text literally states that these two distinct cultures now view each other with deep disdain and vote explicitly against each other's existence.
It's intense. But the most structural, mechanical cause of polarization the text mentions, and this is vital, is gerrymandering.
Yes, gerrymandering. And it comes from an incredibly wild historical paradox. Let's explain how this mechanism actually works. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a seemingly highly democratic ruling, the one-person, one-vote rule.
Sound great in theory.
It legally required states to redraw their congressional districts so that every district had exactly equal population.
Fact.
Right.
In theory, yes. But the text explains how this mandate was weaponized. Because the state legislatures are the ones who actually physically draw these district lines, and because they now use highly advanced granular computer algorithms, they gerrymander the maps with terrifying mathematical accuracy.
How does the computer do it?
By analyzing the precise voting history and demographics we discussed earlier down to the street level, the algorithms can engage in packing.
Packing.
They draw bizarre, snake-like district lines to pack as many opposing voters as possible into a single, massive district. This concedes that one seat to the opposition by a 90% margin, but it dilutes the opposition's voting power across the remaining 5 districts, ensuring the mapmakers win those 5 seats comfortably.
I have to use an analogy here to make the absurdity of this clear. It is exactly like playing a highly competitive sport, say, a soccer match. But the team that is currently winning gets to pause the game, take the chalk, and redraw the out-of-bounds lines in the middle of the field to ensure the opposing team's best players are permanently standing out of bounds. It fundamentally breaks the competitive nature of the game.
The result, as the text argues, is catastrophic for political moderation. Because these districts are mathematically engineered to be unlosable for the incumbent in a general election, the incumbent's only real threat is a primary challenge from a more extreme candidate within their own party's base.
So they have to move to the extremes.
Exactly. To survive, the politician must turn more ideologically partisan and become totally institutionally unconcerned with the opinions of voters in the center.
Now, the text tries to offer a weird silver lining here, stating objectively that this intense polarization markedly boosted voter turnout in 2008 and 2012. But I have to stop and ask the core philosophical question.
Go for it.
If turnout is high solely because two sides absolutely despise each other and view the opposing party as an existential threat to the republic, is that actually a sign of a healthy, functioning democracy?
That is the ultimate stress test question the text forces us to consider. High turnout, driven by a shared sense of civic duty and efficacy, as Anthony Downs described, implies a healthy, collective belief in the legitimacy of the system.
And the alternative?
High turnout, driven purely by polarization, negative partisanship, and fear, implies a system operating under immense, perhaps unsustainable, stress.
Which leads perfectly into our final exploration.
Yeah.
In a landscape this intensely polarized, where the districts are mathematically gerrymandered, where the Electoral College math is rigid and unforgiving, and where voting blocks are fiercely divided, how do modern candidates actually play the game? How do they win?
This is where the rubber meets the road.
We have finally arrived at the modern campaign trail. Knowing everything we've just discussed about the costs of voting, the complex demographics, and the flawed mechanics, this is the actual playbook politicians use to navigate it all.
And the text points out a very clear, highly produced global pattern for modern political campaigns. It can essentially be summarized in one cynical sentence. Keep it general, keep it happy, don't mention parties, and smile a lot.
That sounds like advice for a toothpaste commercial.
It essentially is. The text emphasizes that modern elections are heavily manipulated by the twin, overlapping factors of candidate personality and mass media control. Deep, complex ideology is rarely the centerpiece of a mass national campaign anymore.
The text looks at France as a prime example of this global trend, where traditional journalists frequently complain about the hypermediatization of politics. It is no longer about town hall debates, it's all professionally controlled sets, perfect lighting, and makeup.
The text mentions the French use of what they call le clip politique, highly produced television spots. And they categorize them into three very specific emotional forms.
What are they?
First, the simple jingle clip purely to grab attention. Second, the ideological clip, which doesn't explain policy, but rather sets an idea in visual images. And third, the allegorical clip, designed to portray the candidate not as a public servant, but as an epic, almost mythic hero.
And this overwhelming reliance on carefully curated visual media leads directly to the absolute dominance of the photo op in modern campaigning.
Politicians love a good photo op.
The text explains that campaigns vastly prefer photo ops, say, the candidate wearing a hard hat at a factory or rolling up their sleeves at a diner, because these events show the candidate engaging in seemingly spontaneous, relatable activity without them having to actually speak.
Or, crucially, answer dangerous, unscripted questions from journalists.
The inspiring words can be added later in post-production by the campaign team. The handlers are universally terrified the candidate will actually say something complex or foolish and ruin the carefully constructed, sunny image.
But here's the duality of the modern campaign. While this sunny, issue-less, optimistic image is broadcast on national television to appeal to the few remaining moderate swing voters, the text reveals a much darker, highly targeted strategy running parallel to it.
Out of the general public's view.
Exactly. Operating through direct, targeted mailings, hyperpartisan talk radio, and segmented social media feeds, campaigns rely heavily on scare tactics. These are designed specifically to motivate that highly polarized base we discussed earlier.
The text gives very objective, data-driven examples of this from the 2012 cycle. Democratic campaigns aggressively accusing Mitt Romney of wanting to gut Medicare in order to terrify and motivate older voters. Simultaneously, Republican campaigns telling rural voters that Democrats were plotting to confiscate their firearms.
Fear is used as a highly effective, low-cost tool to artificially overcome down costs of voting and ensure reliable supporters actually show up.
So if the campaigns are just pumping out happy visuals and targeted fear, how do voters actually evaluate the people in power? The text introduces a concept by political scientist Morris P. Fiorina called retrospective voting.
This theory is really interesting. It argues that very, very few voters actually sit down and carefully evaluate complex future policy proposals. It is simply too cognitively expensive.
So what do they do instead?
Instead, Fiorina argues, they look backward. They view the incumbent administration's past 4 years in office as a single package deal. If they feel their life and the government generally went well, they reward the incumbent with another term. If they feel it went poorly, they punish them by voting for the challenger.
And the single most accurate metric for predicting this retrospective judgment, according to the text, is the index of consumer confidence.
This always comes back to the economy.
Always. If the economy feels secure, if people feel their jobs are safe and inflation is low, the incumbent usually wins. The text notes that the massive financial meltdown of 2008 decisively turned that election away from the incumbent Republican Party, regardless of the individual candidate's specific policy papers.
To capitalize on all this data, the demographics, the fears, the economic confidence, modern campaigns use intense micro-targeting. We are far past the days of candidates traveling by train and making general appeals to the entire nation.
Right.
The text describes how modern political parties maintain massive, incredibly detailed databases on every single voter. They aren't just cataloging your voting history, they are tracking your buying habits, your magazine subscriptions, your digital footprint, all to pinpoint your specific localized anxieties.
And because of that brutal winner-take-all Electoral College math we discussed earlier, campaigns take all this micro-targeted data and apply it to only a tiny fraction of the country.
The swing states.
The text points out an astonishing fact. In the 2012 presidential election, the candidates spent nearly all of their time and hundreds of millions of dollars campaigning in only 10 battleground or swing states. They completely, entirely ignored the other 40 states where the partisan outcome was already mathematically predetermined by gerrymandering and demographic sorting.
That is staggering to really think about. The entire multi-billion-dollar machinery of a national election, the supposed combination of the democratic process, is focused entirely on the micro-targeted anxieties of a few 100,000 swing voters in just 10 states.
And to win those specific voters in those specific states, the text explores the somewhat controversial ethics of candidates changing their policy positions, or what the media derisively calls flipping. The text argues that successful candidates are endlessly opportunistic and will reliably modify their deeply held positions toward the center by election day simply to win the most votes.
The text provides very clear historical case studies of this survival tactic. In 1994, the ideological Republican platform included a strict phase-out of agricultural farm subsidies, adhering to free market principles.
But then,
By 2002, Republican President George W. Bush was massively increasing those exact same farm subsidies. Why? Because, as he reportedly admitted privately, to do otherwise would be political suicide for his 2004 re-election chances in key Midwestland farm states. Principles gave way to electoral math. And Democrats, desperate for those exact same swing votes, also abandoned their prior positions and supported the massive subsidies.
the text gives another example regarding the Iraq War. Both Barack Obama and John McCain started very far apart on their timelines for troop withdrawals during their respective primary races to appease their extreme bases. But as the general election approached, both candidates noticeably modified their positions, moving toward the muddy middle, recognizing the absolute necessity to capture the moderate centrist vote. Now, a lot of pundits call this behavior slippery, cynical, or unprincipled flip-flopping. But I'm going to defend the politicians here, and I want to use an analogy. Think of a politician like a thermostat in a house.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the temperature in the room changes, if the collective will of the people shifts over time, you want the thermostat to adjust. If a politician stubbornly sticks to a policy that the public has clearly and loudly rejected, they aren't being principled. They are being unresponsive to the democracy. Isn't a politician modifying their stance based on new public polling data just a literal manifestation of representing the will of the people?
The academic text completely validates that exact perspective. It argues that this opportunism, while often mocked by the press, is really just the core mechanism of democracy in action. Elected officials who rigidly support highly unpopular policies out of ideological purity get voted out of office.
The text includes a fantastic quote about this.
Yes, a deeply pragmatic quote from former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. When a journalist asked him what actually drove his government's policies, he simply replied, "Events, dear boy, events."
Events, dear boy, events.
The text concludes that it is a delicate, continuous, almost impossible balance for a politician. They must project a strong backbone and vision to lead, yet simultaneously remain entirely opportunistic and responsive to the changing realities of the electorate if they want to survive.
And what an incredible, complex journey it has been to uncover exactly what those realities are. We started at the very ground level, looking at the cold, rational, economic math of why a single citizen decides to pay the physical cost of getting off their couch on a busy Tuesday to cast a ballot.
We traced how their age, their income, and their education silently wire their long-term cognitive shortcuts, forming their inherited party IDs.
We looked deeply into the mechanical nightmares of butterfly ballots and the rigid, unforgiving math of the Electoral College that forces political parties to constantly adapt or die.
And we finally saw how modern campaigns synthesize all of this overwhelming data to micro-target our specific fears and hopes, packaging it all in a sunny, heavily produced, issue-less photo op.
I really hope this deep dive has fundamentally upgraded how you watch the daily political news cycle. Because after today, you aren't just watching the screaming talking heads anymore. You are watching the invisible machinery actively at work.
And as we close this analysis, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, which is an extrapolation based directly on the data in the text. The source material explicitly states that by the year 2043, no single racial or ethnic group will form a majority in the United States population.
That's a huge shift.
Today, we have learned that for centuries, the entire strategy of political parties has been about calculating the math of voting blocks, targeting massive demographic groups, appealing to their specific traits, and bending principles to win them over. So what happens to the art of the campaign when the very concept of a majority demographic bloc entirely ceases to exist?
Mm.
Will parties be forced to completely abandon demographic targeting and return purely to broad philosophical arguments about the role of government? Or will they simply invent entirely new, perhaps far more microscopic and insidious ways to divide, categorize, and conquer the electorate?
That is the ultimate question about the future of this invisible machine. We have popped the hood, we've seen the engine, we've traced the fuel lines, and now we have to wonder what happens to the vehicle when the type of fuel fundamentally changes. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Our mission is always to help you become the most well-informed person in the room, and looking past the daily noise to understand the cold, hard science of the ballot box is exactly how we get there. Until next time.